Chapter 571. The peach blossoms blossomed one after another, blooming to the point that it was time for the flowers to break. The fragrant scent turned into miasma, intoxicating all living things and making it difficult for them to wake up again. If they did not wake up, only death awaited them. In the dim and stuffy cockpit, Sulu heard the two words peach miasma, and his mind instantly recalled an old passage of text he had read in the library of the State University years ago. This memory did not occupy him too much of his attention. He was more surprised that the other person actually had such a perfect Federation pronunciation, and that calm and profound indifference the other person displayed. The explosions above the tunnel were still ongoing. Every now and then, violent roars would ring out, causing the ground to tremble incessantly. Flames and gushing air currents came from the depths of the tunnel, heading towards outer space that was cold enough to devour all life. The warship could disintegrate and explode at any time, and the environment was abnormally harsh and dangerous. Yet, the Empire person inside this strangely shaped mech was still so calm and collected as he introduced himself, calmly waiting for the arrival of the battle, without a trace of urgency. Judging from the voice, this Empire mech master was not very old. The cool and indifferent tone even gave people the illusion that the other person was still in his adolescence. Sulu slowly took in deep breaths, mobilizing every bit of burning power in his body. He narrowed his eyes at the Empire mech on the screen, confirming that the other was probably a genius lunatic like Li Feng. Only this kind of person who pursued the realm of mecha battle fanatically would risk the danger of the warship exploding in order to seek a satisfying battle. From another perspective, only people who were extreme in certain aspects could reach such a terrifying level in mecha piloting. Madman Li was like that, and the unknown Empire mech pilot opposite him was like that. Was he not like that himself? Lucio. Su Li's reply rang out from the crudely made external speaker of the slightly battered black MXT. On the snowfield of 5460, there was once an Empire ace pilot who challenged him. At that time, he silently killed the other party in an instant and refused to say a single word. This was because the difference in strength between the two parties was too great. It was an unequal battle, so why would he need to play those chivalrous tricks? This Imperial mecha opposite him had enough qualifications to make Sulu respected out of caution. Moreover, he also wanted to use this opportunity to adjust his still shaken mental state. Thus, he had temporarily come up with a name for his mecha. The two words Lucio naturally referred to him and Shang Qiu, the two most crucial figures in the Federation's research and development of the MX mecha. Hearing this name, the Imperial mecha, Peach Miasma, did not react at all. Perhaps the young officer inside had recalled some information and guessed Su Li's identity. The Peach Miasma mecha did not react. It did not move. Sulu narrowed his eyes even more. The other party was waiting for him to make the first move. They clearly knew how terrifying his MXT was, yet they still stood in the distance arrogantly and indifferently, unwilling to make the first move. What kind of pride and confidence did this represent? Other than that legendary princess, when had such a powerful figure appeared in the Empire? He took a deep breath, and the source of the scorching power behind his waist instantly spread throughout his entire body. He could clearly feel the power transmitted to every pair of muscle fibers, every pore, and every nail. Two unhealthy but exceptionally bright blushes appeared on his pale cheeks. The auxiliary valve used to connect to the satellite's propulsion device popped off from the black MXT's metal waistline with a click. Amidst the roaring airflow, it fell to the ground behind him. Boom! The black MXT burst forward. Under the boost of the full power of its dual engines, the huge body of the mecha instantly accelerated. It actually broke through the air in the tunnel with a terrifying sonic boom. Almost at the same time, the Imperial mecha called Peach Miasma also moved, charging over with a boom. This strange and even somewhat ugly mecha with metal boxes hanging all over its body started slightly later than the black MXT controlled by Su Lo. However, with the full power output of the microengines at the spherical joints, it actually completely closed the gap between the speed of the two mecha in an extremely short amount of time. The black MXT trembled violently, like a man in the prime of his life who had epilepsy. Its two heavy mechanical legs moved forward in a strange manner like lightning. Amidst the ghostly and elusive visual effects, it was full of valiant willpower. The Cyan Empire mecha seemed to be unable to withstand the current speed and also began to tremble. The metal boxes attached to the joints of the mecha let out a rapid and concentrated sound, like countless small war drums being beaten at the same time. The two most advanced mechas in the universe collided fiercely with no surprise. The air around the tall mecha was squeezed away at the same time, sweeping up the debris, turning into a mottled ball that suddenly swelled up. Then, the violent and dull sound of the collision rang out. Then, there was a series of incomparably sharp sounds of metal colliding. No one knew how many effective controls the Black MXT and the Cyan mecha had performed in this instant, and how many close-range dodges they had performed in small areas. The naked eye could not see the flowing light of the mechas in that mottled spherical space at all. Only these concentrated sounds of metal colliding reverberated in all directions, suppressing the whistling sound produced by the high-speed air leakage of the battleship. The support valve that the Black MXT had bounced off earlier finally fell to the ground at this time, rolling and hitting the tunnel wall before coming to a stop. The two mechas that were exchanging blows at a terrifying control rate also seemed to pause slightly at the same time. After a momentary pause, a piercing light flashed, as if to split apart this entanglement of danger. The source of the light was not the Cyan mecha, but the sharp alloy knife at the front of the Black MXT's right mechanical arm. This was the most dangerous moment. Inside the cockpit, Su Li's eyes suddenly lit up. His body hovering in the air, he controlled the Black MXT to perform the last of the 10 poses that the uncle had taught him, and also the most ruthless one. The Black MXT crashed madly into the Cyan mecha's arms, its mechanical leg suddenly springing up, the tip of its knee aiming straight for the Cyan mecha's lower abdomen. The movement was clean and efficient to the extreme, but also extremely valiant. It did not care about the follow-up movements at all, only wanting to live and die together. However, that sharp alloy knife, that similarly piercing light, retracted in an instant with an aura that was the complete opposite of madness. Silently, it stabbed out from under the mecha's elbow, sinisterly stabbing towards the Cyan mecha's cockpit amidst a sea of dazzling debris and strong winds. The Cyan mecha had not been able to determine the direction of this stab, and had not been able to guess the soft and sinister strike that the Black MXT would make after its sudden burst. No matter how strong the control of that Empire genius was, it was likely that there was no way he could avoid this suddenly dimmed but now even more dangerous light in such a small space. Therefore, the Cyan mecha did not retreat. Instead, its body shook violently, and it charged forward fiercely. In the shortest amount of time, its left mechanical arm blocked the front of that light, while its entire body performed an exquisite sliding step backwards, sweeping towards the right side of the Black MXT. Amidst the violent and frenzied attacks of the Black MXT, there was a sinister and silent fatal blow hidden within. The Cyan Empire mecha, on the other hand, performed a sliding step backwards that seemed to violate the laws of physics in its high-speed dash. At this moment, the two mecha displayed their most impressive side. Two completely opposite control techniques actually overlapped so perfectly at the same time. Other than the two people in the cockpit, who else could do such a thing? Unable to avoid that stab, the Cyan Empire mecha took a step forward, as if a storm was brewing beneath its feet. An irresistible monarch's aura gushed out. At the same time, it slid backwards in that instant, turning it into an awe-inspiring king's bow, indestructible. There was an arrow on the string, and the arrow was precisely that heavy alloy spear. Su Li's face did not show any signs of shock or fear. Like a child immersed in a cartoon, he stared at the cold light of the alloy spear on the screen, his body trembling uncontrollably. He did not allow the MXT to attempt any evasive maneuvers, but instead valiantly chose to continue attacking with his knife. He wanted to stake his life on the line. He wanted to bet on which of the two would pierce the other's cockpit first. He wanted to bet on the hardness values of the Federation and the Empire Mecha's protective boards. He wanted to bet on his own and the other's willpower. He wanted to bet on his luck in this moment of life and death. Right now, the scene was like two warships flying at relatively high speeds in a small warp tunnel. Whoever could not bear the smell of death and tried to avoid it first would lose the momentum and initiative in this battle of courage, or perhaps stupidity. For Su Li, he had no choice but to fight. Facing this majestic and inviolable Cyan Empire mecha, he had no confidence in a normal battle, not to mention that he was currently on the Empire's warship. Moreover, he already had no path of retreat and had walked into a dead end. If he did not fight now, when would he fight? The blade brushed past the upper edge of the Cyan mecha's left mechanical arm and stabbed down like a ghost in the wind. It easily pierced through the metal boxes attached to the joints of the other's mechanical arm and then continued forward, the sharp alloy knife ruthlessly piercing through the outer wall of the other's cockpit. Up until now, the Cyan mecha was still cold and silent. It did not make any evasive maneuvers, as if there was not the slightest bit of fear in the face of impending death. Perhaps the Empire officer inside the mecha did not even think of death as a threat at all. He believed that he was stronger than death itself. A strong sense of unease flashed through Su Li's heart. However, in this high-frequency battle on the microsecond scale, once one decided to go all out for the kill, there was no room for retreat. The black MXT trembled violently. The alloy knife at the front of the right mechanical arm broke through another 2 layers of the Empire mecha's cockpit superhard alloy protective boards and finally made contact with the other's inner wall. In less than the blink of an eye, it would be able to pierce through and kill that unknown Empire elite. However, right at this moment, the metal box that had been pierced first exploded. The explosion was not very powerful, but the precise angle of the bullet's explosion and the self-destructing armor made the black MXT's alloy knife pause abruptly. Like a mechanical device without electricity, it sizzled for a moment and then came to an abrupt stop, turning into a lifeless statue. The final half a meter of distance between victory and defeat turned out to be so far away. The alloy multi-layer forging spear pierced deeply into the black MXT's cockpit. Sparks flashed from time to time from the hole that had been cracked by the powerful force. The Cyan Empire mecha held the other end of the spear and looked down at the kneeling black MXT from above. It was as cold and proud as a monarch. The spear was slowly pulled out of the black MXT's cockpit. The original metallic gray was slightly blackened by the mecha, and there were also a few large patches of shocking bright red on it. It was like a spring peach painting scroll drawn with ink and cinnabar. Chapter 572. The metal spear shrank and shortened with a crack, and a few drops of dye-like liquid fell from the impact. The outer armor of the green peach miasma mecha opened from the middle, and the spear was stored inside like a sword sheath. The soul-devouring chill gradually disappeared. In front of the warship's passage, there was a heavy sound of metal rails rubbing against each other. The automatic repair device outside the warship ran over through the thick slide rail. Countless welding points began to burn in the thin air, glowing and heating. Finally, the temporary repair of the hole was completed, and the howling hurricane in the passage was much softer. However, there was no way to effectively control the fire and explosion on the upper deck of the warship. The soldiers of the Empire ran into the passageway and looked at the fallen Black Federation mecha on the ground and the standing green mecha with complicated expressions. They guessed in shock what had just happened and who was inside the green mecha. Prepare to evacuate. An indifferent and calm voice came from the green mecha, but it did not allow anyone to question or object. Then, with the humming sound of hydraulic pressure, the cockpit of the mecha that had a large hole in it slowly opened. Dim light spilled in and shone on someone's body. It was an ordinary face. The lines weren't deep, but they were clear. It made his facial features look a little cold, especially the calm pride that came from his bones. For some reason, it made people feel that the word valiant came from his handwriting. Huai Chaoshi undid the black data band on his body and stood on the heavy and thick metal door of the cockpit. His thin body did not tremble in the cold air of the tunnel. He looked at the troublesome Federation mecha a few meters away from him and listened to the automatic alarm of the warship system. He could not help but slowly narrow his eyes. The Empire killed that tiger and destroyed the ancient bell. The Federation officer in this mecha killed Duke Carton and was going to destroy this flagship. This revenge was really equal, he thought in his heart. The soldiers below the mecha were operating the heavy suspension tools, trying to open the cockpit of the MXT mecha. Although they were nervous and did not know how His Majesty and the military would deal with them after Duke Carton's tragic death, as soldiers, they knew very well how important this new Federation mecha was to the Empire. They had to take this mecha away with them as much as possible before they evacuated. After a few shouts, the cockpit of the MXT mecha was finally successfully opened. The Empire's soldiers angrily dragged Sulu out of the cockpit and threw him to the ground like trash. At the same time, the engineers began to connect the data to prevent the Federation mecha from self-destructing. He didn't die. Huai Chaoshi looked down at the ground and thought in surprise. The waist of the young Federation officer on the ground was a mess of flesh and blood. His short black hair was tangled together by sweat and was messily resting beside his pale face. There was no trace of trembling under his closed eyelids. He was probably in a deep coma. Despite having his cockpit pierced by an alloy spear, the other party was still alive. Kai Chaoshi did not know how this Federation officer had managed to do this at the last moment, and a faint sense of vigilance grew in her heart. He jumped down from the Peach Miasma mecha and walked towards the unconscious Su Lo. The sound of his leather military boots was unusually clear and loud. It was jarring even in the noisy tunnel. Looking down at Su Lo with his hands behind his back, Huai Chaoshi's narrowed eyes gradually relaxed. There was no trace of a smile on his face. Instead, there was some kind of consideration. Right at this moment, the fingers on Su Li's right hand trembled slightly. It seemed to be an involuntary reaction from the nerves in his coma. A series of low explosions sounded in the cockpit of the black MXT mecha. The engine roared, and smoke and dust flew everywhere. The Federation soldiers who were in the midst of data connection and deciphering inside the mecha were affected by this explosion. They screamed as they were shaken out of the cockpit and set on fire. A cold light flashed through Huai Chaoshi's eyes. He subconsciously turned his head to look. The unconscious and seriously injured Su Lu suddenly opened his eyes at this time. His body that was originally as weak as a garbage bag suddenly trembled violently and bounced up. His legs crossed in front of him like lightning, and his fists were like iron hammers that broke through the wind and blasted out. He did not know the identity of this young Federation soldier in front of him. Although he looked like he was wearing a normal soldier's uniform, to be able to possess such terrifying mecha piloting skills and such a mentality, the other was definitely not a normal character. Heavily injured and on the brink of death, if he wanted to live, the only way was to take this Federation soldier as a hostage. This was his last chance. His heavily injured and exhausted body could only support him for one last attempt. The wind from his fists was like a hammer, his body like iron, his footsteps like the wind. Su Lu placed all of his hopes for survival on this one blow. The mysterious burning power he had cultivated for many years gushed out. Using the powerful close combat techniques he had practiced since childhood, he held nothing back as he blasted it all out. This young Federation soldier in front of him was definitely a genius in mecha piloting. He was even stronger than Su Lu in Madman Li, but, when it came to close combat attacks, who could be his match? A ray of light suddenly appeared in the midst of despair, the wind from his fists howled. The air vibrated, and the afterimages trembled. It was unstoppable. Huai Chaoshi turned his head and saw this scene from the corner of his eye. His pupils contracted abruptly, and then, that normal and indifferent face actually did not show the slightest trace of panic or fear. There was only calmness and a completely aroused desire to fight. Bang 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 bang. A series of dense explosive sounds exploded between the two people's bodies. It was just like how the two mecha had attacked each other without any regard for their own lives the moment they met. The wind from his fists and the shadows of his legs flashed. Simple, direct, and powerful close combat joint techniques were thrown out. Who knew how many punches landed on the other's blocking arms, and how many vicious finger thrusts landed on the other's body? Huai Chaoshi's body suddenly froze. He took 3 steps back before stabilizing himself. A trickle of blood seeped out from the corner of his lips, but he stubbornly refused to fall. Before he retreated, his foot wearing a hard military boot stomped down viciously on Su Li's lower abdomen. This kick was fast and swift. It was simple to the extreme, but also terrifying to the extreme. It was like a reef in the middle of the waves. There was not much of a stance. Just by being hard and steady, it could break through the white foam and salty water for billions of years. Su Li's body was kicked viciously to the ground. His already injured waist and abdomen were bleeding profusely. His abdomen felt like it was being torn apart, and he no longer had any ability to fight. His legs were limp and paralyzed. He leaned against the metal wall of the passageway, breathing heavily. He stared at the young Empire soldier in front of him, his eyes full of shock. Defeated, and thoroughly defeated. He was not a match for this Empire youth in mecha piloting. Even in close combat, he had actually lost to the other. Who exactly was this Empire soldier in front of him? How could such a skinny body contain such a huge amount of energy? He vaguely thought of a possibility, but he did not dare to believe it. Su Li's face was deathly pale. He knew that he would never be able to return to the Federation alive. He stared at the Empire soldier in front of him with complicated emotions. He wanted to say something, but instead he spat out a mouthful of blood, which splattered all over his body and onto the ground. Huai Chaoshi walked over with an expressionless face. She raised her right foot and kicked him heavily in the chest. Only the sound of bones cracking could be heard and a sentence filled with endless resentment and anger could be heard. Chapter 573. The morning sun shone on the training grounds of the Federation's 1st Military Region's Special Mecha Team. The dense foliage fanned out the light and separated the temperature, making the feeling of late spring and early summer blur together. The military camp, which was usually tense and serious, seemed to be more relaxed and lively because of this rare long holiday. There were no more emergency orders in the middle of the night, and the seemingly never-ending actual combat exercises finally came to an end for the time being. There was a small pond beside the Special Mecha Team's camp. Nominally, it was under the jurisdiction of HTD Bureau, but in reality, it had long become a small lake in the backyard of the soldiers. The young men full of testosterone had launched fierce attacks on the amphibians in the pond out of curiosity, but in the end, they found that their stomachs didn't seem to like those thin green legs that looked like level 2 hard synthetic meat. There was a young man wearing a well-ironed military uniform beside the pond. Under the tight military uniform hid a burly and explosive body. There was a hint of arrogance and ruthlessness in his cold eyes. Only the warm and clear morning sun shone directly on his face, could illuminate the last trace of youthfulness on this face. Li Feng came from Philadelphia. He was one of the top elites of the federal military. Even if Su Le came out of nowhere, he couldn't steal his glory. He was about to step into the most beautiful years of his 20s. It was a good time for the lush green leaves to bloom in the spring breeze. However, for some reason, he had been feeling inexplicably restless these past few days, but he couldn't find the source of this restlessness. Thus, after waking up in the wee hours of the morning and completing his routine electric current stimulation, he came to this small pond to silently think. He left home at a young age and completed his puberty amidst the flames of war in the West Woods. Growing up was so exciting that it was even a little deformed, so he rarely came home to Philadelphia. However, perhaps because of his bloodline and respect, he always subconsciously learned or imitated that great-grandfather of his. The wristwatch on his left wrist tightened slightly and vibrated clearly. Li Feng looked down and saw that it was an emergency order. Although his face was still expressionless, his strong heart couldn't help but twitch slightly. He abruptly stood up and walked towards the barracks. Under the banyan tree by the pond, 2 officers flashed out and caught up with his quick footsteps. At the same time, under his gaze, they began to quickly make phone calls, hoping to be the first to know what this emergency assembly meant before the Department of Defense's order was clear. A few years ago, Li Feng had caused havoc in Parliament Hill and turned Senator Zion's office into a garbage dump. To prevent such a vicious incident from happening again, Philadelphia and the Department of Defense had jointly sent trusted officers to guard him. It was just that they had been together for too long. While these officers were carrying out military orders, they naturally became his direct subordinates. Something big must have happened, but I don't have enough authority, so I can't find out. An officer moved the phone away from his ear and looked at Li Feng's thick back and said uneasily. Li Feng's footsteps suddenly stopped. He turned around and took the phone. After dialing a number, he waited for a moment and said softly, "Yuzi, it's me. Today's emergency assembly has been confirmed. This is a joint mission of all 4 military regions. The security level has also been raised. I want to know why." With his family background, there was no secret that the federal military could hide from him. However, the Philadelphia family would not allow him to use this privilege. Fortunately, although he was not old, he had a few trustworthy and capable friends of the same age in the Federation. However, what made him feel shocked and strongly uneasy was that Zhou Yu, after trying for a long time, could only apologetically say that there was no way to find out the specifics. She only knew that something big must have happened in the Federation. Li Feng stood in the shadow under the banyan tree silently for a moment, completely ignoring the increasingly urgent emergency assembly call in the barracks ahead. Suddenly, he picked up the phone and pressed a string of familiar numbers that he couldn't be more familiar with. The call didn't go through. It wasn't busy, it wasn't transferred to the General Staff Department, it wasn't out of service, it was just that there was no response, no response. He dialed again, but the call still didn't go through. Li Feng raised his head and looked at the clear light between the leaves. Suddenly, a hint of viciousness flashed across his face. He pressed the number again, so viciousness that it seemed to want to break the sturdy military phone. The call went through, and a beautiful female voice came through. "Hello, this is the General Staff Department Transfer Center of the West Woods Military Region. According to the relevant regulations, please register your name." The viciousness between Li Feng's brows suddenly dimmed. His eyes widened in disbelief as he slowly hung up the phone. The other end of the call was the most standard transfer procedure, but he knew that ever since he was 12 years old, as long as he made a call, the person on the other end of the call would definitely pick up immediately. A military vehicle roared as it left the Special Mecha Brigade's camp. The soldiers who were in the midst of an emergency assembly looked at the smoke and dust on the road in shock. They didn't know what was wrong with the young prodigy in the vehicle, actually daring to defy military orders and leave. In the passenger seat of the dark green military vehicle, Li Feng buried his head in his strong body, as if he didn't want to hear what the officer in the back seat said. The news received from Philadelphia is that the 3 major fleets have already set off, and the fastest light fleet is currently heading towards the Night Scorpion Nebula. Their target is the location of the ancient bell. The officer put down the phone and reported in shock and difficulty, the ancient bell was ambushed by the Empire's fleet, no one survived. Li Feng's shoulders suddenly stiffened, but he didn't make any sound. He just moved up and down slightly with the movement of the military vehicle. Suddenly, without any warning, the usually arrogant and violent head that was hanging low in his body let out a series of painful howls, just like an injured beast. Madman Li had been fighting in the front lines of the West Woods since he was 12 years old. He always had a goal in front of him, and it wasn't as unreachable as his grandfather by the lake. Instead, it was so real and close. During his youth, he grew up under the care of that person. In a sense, that person partially replaced the role of his father in his life. No one knew how close his relationship with the West Woods tiger was. Even the Philadelphia family didn't know, and no one could imagine how he would feel when he heard the bad news. The officer in the vehicle was pale. They were Li Feng's most loyal partners and subordinates. They only knew a little about the situation, but they didn't expect him to have such a big reaction. "Where are we going at this time?" "To the spaceport. I want to go back to the West Woods." Maybe it was because he buried his head in his arms, or maybe it was because of something else. Li Feng's voice sounded a little dull and weak at the moment. "This is disobeying a military order, and, if Director Li knows, he will definitely not agree." One of the officers suppressed the nervousness in his heart and refuted. Li Feng raised his head and glanced at the officer in the vehicle. His voice was flat as he said, I want to go back to the West Woods." He didn't cry when he heard the news of Commander Zhong's death, but at the moment, his eyes were red and full of terrifying veins that were triggered by his violent emotions. Facing such a pair of eyes and such a calm and terrifying tone, no one dared to raise any objections. Even if these officers could guess that once Li Feng returned to the West Woods, he would definitely do something earth-shattering. At this moment, the phone rang again. General Li Jadu said calmly, "What do you want to do?" "I want to kill someone." Li Feng heard his father's voice, and a trace of stubbornness flashed across his handsome face. He said, "No one can fucking stop me." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the phone. Li Jadu didn't expect that the news of Zhong Shouhu's death would actually make his son so angry and agitated. After a moment, he said, "Sulu has already gone over. Give me the authority." Li Feng paused for a moment and said, "I want to see him do it." In the command hall on the outskirts of the capital special district, there was a commotion. Countless senior technicians were decrypting and restoring a section of the signal from a distant star region. The senior staff of the Department of National Defense, with the help of computers, were frowning and thinking hard about many complicated things. Who gave him the authority to use the charter network that the Federation buried in advance? A gloomy and angry roar sounded in the hall. The director of the Military Committee of the Federation Parliament looked at the data feedback on the giant screen excitedly and waved his arms vigorously. "This is related to the foundation of the Federation's attack on the Empire. Make him stop immediately." The National Security Advisor's expression was also ugly. He said gloomily into the microphone, "Three-winged battleship, I order you to stop immediately and withdraw immediately. Otherwise..." Bang! A porcelain vase that was thrown into the hall interrupted the anger of these big shots. The crisp sound of the vase shattering shocked everyone. The entire command hall was silent for a moment. Li Feng didn't know what he threw at the vase. He walked over with a gloomy face. The military police in the command hall immediately surrounded him. At this time, sitting on the second floor, the president waved his hand with a gloomy expression. The military police had to disperse and let this ruthless lieutenant colonel walk directly to the control panel. At this time, dozens of hours had passed since the attack on the ancient bell. In the Federation society, which appeared to be peaceful on the surface, it was just a few days of changing between day and night. However, for the people who heard this shocking news, it was extremely torturous. The Bureau of Proclamation's tri-winged battleship followed the Empire's fleet into the enemy's star sector in a decisive and reckless manner. The signal passed through the giant warp hole, and there was no fixed signal to amplify it, so it was somewhat unstable. The people in the command hall could only see blurry and intermittent images and the whimsical plan that they had just received. Li Feng stood in front of the control panel and slowly lowered his body to the microphone. He squeezed out a sentence from his solid chest, "Su Lu, help me kill him. If you can't do it this time, I will do it next time." A few minutes later, the entire command hall heard Su Li's reply from the tri-winged battleship, "I will kill him." Then the communication was cut off. 7 hours later, a civilian smuggling spaceship from the West Woods sent back the latest news to S1. This smuggling spaceship was monitoring the military channel a few days ago and learned that the ancient bell was attacked. As criminals who should not be exposed to the public, the people on the smuggling spaceship bravely made the decision to rescue Commander Zhong. However, when they arrived, they only saw the wreckage on the ground and a rescue capsule that flew back according to the predetermined procedure. Other than that, there was nothing. Chapter 574. The last image that the people of the Federation saw was shot by the Bureau of Proclamation's tri-wing warship. In the last image, the Empire's flagship exploded violently and turned into a dazzling firework in the quiet space. Then, even the tri-wing warship disappeared into the vast universe. The confirmation of the culprit of the attack on the ancient bell, the famous butcher general of the Empire, made many people in the upper class of the Federation excited. However, there was no news of Su Lu, which reduced the joy of revenge to the lowest point. That night, the Federation news channel authorized by the government turned into a black and white monochrome broadcast. All advertisements and entertainment programs were stopped. The news anchor reported the news of the attack on the ancient bell to hundreds of millions of Federation citizens with a sad and angry voice. At the same time, he claimed that the special forces sent by the federal military had successfully destroyed the shameless Empire's fleet. In the middle of the repeated news, it was the life of Zhong Suohu, the commander of the West Woods military region. The Federation government spared no effort to publicize the great achievements of this tiger in the front line for more than 10 years. The prosperous and safe Upper Woods region was shocked, and the remote and lonely East Woods region was shocked. The entire Federation society was shrouded in a gloomy fog. If the Federation government had not announced the successful revenge, this gloomy mood might have directly aroused the uneasiness of society. As for the West Woods region, which guarded the border of the Federation like stubborn orphans, had already fallen into hysterical anger and sadness. 3 moons climbed up, shining on the wild vegetables in Little Sister's basket. 3 moons fell, eating up the wild vegetables made by Little Sister. 3 moons disappeared, Little Sister also disappeared. 3 moons rose, Little Sister, when will you come back? Just like the helplessness and anger of this ballad that was created decades ago, and just like how Zhong Suohu lamented to Su Lu in the restaurant, the people of the West Woods uneasily and sorrowfully thought that they were just orphans of the Federation, wandering in the universe, singing sad songs in the west wind. No one would care about the life and death of the people of the West Woods. Fortunately, they had the Zhong family. For the past 10 years, they had that insufferably arrogant tiger. But now, that ferocious and friendly tiger had died without warning. In an instant, the people of the West Woods could not accept the fact that they had lost their hero, their leader. When they finally confirmed that this sad fact could not be changed, countless West Woods soldiers swarmed to the periphery of the old house in Wait 2 district. They hugged their weapons and sat on the ground, forming a long line along several roads. No one organized them. They just subconsciously wanted to protect the commander's home and prevent any outsiders from coming. More people of the West Woods began to cry and criticize the corruption of the Federation government and the incompetence of the federal fleet. Thinking of the West Woods sweating and bleeding by the Federation, and the abruptness of the whole incident, countless conspiracy theories began to circulate in private. Just as the cosmic war between the Federation and the Empire was about to begin, social unrest in the West Woods at the front line would lead to extremely serious consequences. What worried the Federation government even more was that no one knew whether the West Woods soldiers and civilians who were loyal to the Zhong family would have more direct and strong political demands because of this incident. The Federation had to stabilize the situation in the West Woods as soon as possible, and in the current tense situation, there were not many people who had enough influence to appease the people of the West Woods and show the Federation's sincerity to the soldiers and civilians of the West Woods. After thinking for a few hours, the old man by Lake Feiqing politely declined the request of the president's residents to go to the West Woods to stabilize the situation. In the early morning, the Federation news channel broadcasted an urgent news. The president of the Federation would immediately set off for the West Woods to preside over the grand funeral of Commander Zhong, his wife, and the soldiers of the Antique Bell. The people were in a frenzy, and the people's hearts were uncertain. Every combat unit in Ceylon's military was in a dangerous situation where they were absolutely on guard and had no clue what to do. President Pavel's decision to head to Ceylon to appease the people had, without a doubt, demonstrated his courage and determination that was different from normal politicians. And before the president went to the West Woods, there was a more important matter to deal with. 3:30 in the morning, in the underground combat command room of the president's residence. The fact that the Empire's fleet could find the gap in the charter network and use our top-secret electronic imprint to cover it shows a lot of problems. The Department of Defense has newly coded all the electronic code systems 3 days ago, but if those problems can't be solved fundamentally, these technical means will become meaningless. President Pabre's voice was still strong, but his dark face looked a little thin and tired. Although the last conversation between them before Zhong Suehu left the capital did not achieve a satisfactory result, the president was still willing to see Commander Zhong as a kindred spirit. A potential political ally was buried in a space fireworks that no one expected. This blow and the situation in the West Woods that followed made the president feel a lot of pressure. Fortunately, at this time, he did not have to worry that some families or spokespersons in the Federation would dare to question his decision to attack the Empire. I don't know if Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu has any evidence for what he said, and I don't want to investigate the source of his information. His outstanding performance on the battlefield, as well as his brave actions in chasing after the Empire's fleet, can completely prove his loyalty and love for the Federation. President Pabre's eyes swept over everyone in the room like a hawk, from the National Security Advisor, the Minister of Defense, the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, important cabinet ministers, specially invited representatives of the Parliament. He said in a deep voice, he said that there is still a seed of the Empire that is still in the Federation, so I ask you to find it. According to Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's information, the Federation Investigation Bureau entered the military prison as soon as possible, but did not find the target. The director of the Federation Investigation Bureau in a pure black suit looked at him and said seriously, but according to the preliminary investigation, we did find some problems. As for where that seed of suspicion is now, we need the help of the Bureau of Proclamation. Since the Bureau of Proclamation has been observing the seed, they should know where it is now. The target of this sentence was very clear. The eyes of the big shots in the Federation in the room all fell on a chair at the round table. The assistant director of the Bureau of Proclamation, Chui Zedong, was temporarily relieved of all authority 3 days ago. 3 special agents of the Special Task Force stood behind him at this time. Facing the suspicious and angry gazes of his colleagues, he said slowly with difficulty, "I have already explained that the Bureau of Proclamation suspended the investigation of that seed of suspicion because I directly received an email from the Office of the Minister of Defense, saying that the suspect is involved in a special military mission and needs to be temporarily quarantined." Minister of Defense Zhou Yingxing, who had been silent all this time, said, "I did not send such an email. For the sake of maximum safety, after the Medellin project, the President has already rejected the related anti-discord plan. Director Zedong has just confirmed that the seed has disappeared or died, but I can't be at ease, so Assistant Chui, I think you need to be quarantined for a long time. As for the Office of the Minister of Defense, it must also be investigated." Zhou Yingxing nodded slightly, not deliberately hiding the heavy expression between his eyebrows. "In 2 hours, I will be going to the West Woods. I hope that the relevant investigation can come to a clear conclusion before the charter I arrives at Sunset State." President Pobre looked at the crowd sternly and said, "Everyone here is a pillar of the Federation. If there is a problem with any of us, it will be a big problem for the Federation. This matter involves the Bureau of Proclamation and the Ministry of Defense. The Federation Investigation Bureau does not have the ability to complete the investigation, so I have decided that the military combat forces will conduct the investigation. The investigation team will report directly to me, and I will leave the details to Mr. Byron. Vice President Byron has the authority to investigate the internal work of the Bureau of Proclamation, but according to the first charter, any powerful government agency, especially the military, is prohibited from actively interfering with the affairs of the Bureau of Proclamation." Chui Zedong's expression changed. He did not care about his current situation and raised his objection loudly. "The military investigation team will not interfere with the affairs of the Bureau of Proclamation. They are investigating you." President Pobre looked at him coldly and said without any trace of politeness. Chui Zedong's expression changed drastically. He tried to get the president to retract the order, but even when he was escorted out of the conference room by 3 special task force agents, he still turned around and struggled to express his objection. "Lieutenant General Du Shaoqing will be in charge of this investigation." President Pobre looked at the crowd and said in a heavy tone, "The death of Commander Zhong has proven the crazy aggressive instinct of the Empire. When it comes to the survival of the Federation, no department can stay out of it, not even the Bureau of Proclamation." The big shots in the conference room turned their eyes collectively again and looked at a shadowy corner outside the round table. Du Shaoqing, who had been sitting silently in the corner, slowly stood up. His straight military posture was impeccable. He gave the president a standard military salute and said in a deep voice, "I will not disappoint you." In the eyes of many people, Du Shaoqing, who had accumulated military merits to the rank of lieutenant general, would not be able to sit in the position of commander of the Iron 7th Division for too long. Although people were still used to calling him Commander Shaoqing in a respectful tone, the military talent he had displayed at the front line of the West Woods did indeed need a bigger stage. No one would have thought that his latest big stage would be the investigation team of the Federation appointed by the president himself. And the investigation was the mystery of the death of his lifelong enemy. Under his command, the fully armed soldiers divided and surrounded the Bureau of Proclamation and the Ministry of Defense as if they were in a battle. They cleanly invited the suspects of the Bureau of Proclamation and the Ministry of Defense back to the military camp from their homes. Ignoring the fierce resistance of the lawyers, they used all means to extend the detention period as much as possible and gradually deepened the investigation. Du Shaoqing, on the other hand, was silent in front of his desk. There was an old photo frame on the desk, and in front of the desk was a violin case. The long case was not opened, and no clear sound came out. Chapter 575. In the outskirts of the capital city of southern Galilee on planet S2, there was a heavily guarded special level 3 class of military prison. 2 days ago, hundreds of serious-looking members of the Federation Investigation Bureau were stationed here with the authorization documents of the Ministry of Defense. The black suits that were flashing at the checkpoints of countless rooms replaced the dark green military uniforms, which made the people in the prison feel extremely depressed. 3 days before the Federation Investigation Bureau took over this military prison, a prisoner mysteriously disappeared. No one knew how this prisoner left the special level 3 class of military prison. Even the Bureau of Proclamation lost the specific location of this person's identity chip, but there was no feedback that the information node disappeared. The investigation team appointed by President Pobre followed the footsteps of the Federation Investigation Bureau to this prison. The Internal Affairs Officer of the Iron 7th Division from the 2nd Military Region increased the intensity of the investigation of the prison under the cold command of President Du Shaoqing. The prisoners in the prison were all gathered in the side area. The cells that they used to live in became the prison's hell. From time to time, angry roars, curses, and screams could be heard from the 3rd floor of the prison. As many as 700 government employees and officers turned this prison into a surprisingly large interrogation room. They used all kinds of legal methods, but they still couldn't find any clues. The Federation's investigation of the attack on the ancient Bell ship and its efforts to find the hidden seed fell into a helpless halt. At this moment, countless pairs of anxious and angry eyes didn't notice a small forest 13 kilometers to the right of the prison. Under the simple building of the forest, there was a hidden underground fortification. At the end of the fortification, there was a dark room without any light or electronic equipment. The dim light of the primitive incandescent lamp shone on the rough stone walls of the room. The light gradually gathered to the side of the bed in the corner of the room, revealing a thin, pale, and desperate face. He had a very common name, He Yu. He was 36 years old this year. He entered the 2nd Military Academy at the age of 17. After graduation, he had been working in the Military Intelligence Department. Although the information he came in contact with was top secret and somewhat mysterious to the general public, this kind of work would become ordinary and boring after a long time. However, He Yu was not dissatisfied. He liked the breakfast sold outside the electronic code station building. He was used to the smell of disinfectant and light curtain glue in the building. Not to mention, when he was 30 years old, he fell in love with a waitress in the logistics department of the building. He had a gentle and kind wife, a daughter who was just 4 years old but still waited for him with a sweet smile and slippers every day. He had an ordinary but stable, and indeed meaningful job. He Yu was satisfied enough with this life. He Yu had always thought so, until one day more than a year ago, when he was driving home, he was suddenly stopped by a group of soldiers and arrested. Then, he learned the truth that was like a thunderclap. He Yu was a seed that was planted in the Federation. He Yu was from the Empire. No, this is such a ridiculous prank. I was born in the S2 industrial base, and my parents only gave birth to me when they were in their 40s. I have countless childhood friends and teachers who know of my existence, and you actually say that I'm from the Empire. Adoption certificate. No, I don't believe it. Biological markers. That's fake. What are you trying to do? I'm just a very ordinary officer. I don't have anything you want on me. Why must you accuse me of being from the Empire? More than a year ago, when He Yu heard this ridiculous accusation, his first reaction was this. That absurd feeling of astonishment turned into hysteria. This made him, who was considered to be extremely cowardly in the military academy, actually dare to ignore the gun barrels in the hands of those wardens. He angrily swung his fist and smashed it towards the brown-haired officer's face across the wide interrogation table. However, he did not hit the other party. Instead, he was smashed to the ground by the cold butt of the gun. After waking up from his coma, facing the detailed records of the Bureau of Proclamation and the ironclad evidence, Yu finally admitted to a certain fact in despair and frustration. Many years ago, the Empire took the risk of using a small spaceship to forcefully cross the space channel and transport a few batches of babies into Bermuda. Then, through the notorious human traffickers of Bermuda, they were sold to the Federation. They were sold to parents who did not have children but longed for them. These innocent and childish babies, who were even sleeping with their eyes closed, passed the examination of the charter and received a legal adoption certificate. An identity chip was implanted behind their necks. Without them knowing, they turned from being from the Empire to citizens of the Federation. And he was one of these babies that I was originally from the Empire. Then, when I cheered for every victory of the Federal Army on the front lines of the West Woods, was I actually celebrating the death of my own people? My life was all fake. An ordinary name, an ordinary job, a stable and happy life. They were all fake. Then, what was real? Yu, who could not accept this fact, became an ice sculpture that could not think. In just 3 days, his face became so thin that his bones could be seen. He knew that the Federation would not allow an Empire spy like him to live. Although before this, he did not know that he was arranged by the Empire to be a spy from the moment he was born. In a situation where he did not know and had no choice, he became a natural spy. He did not do anything bad, but he had to pay the price for a life that he did not know. What a sad and absurd life this was. However, the subsequent development of the matter was completely out of his expectations. If this was a nightmare, Yu would never have thought that after waking up from the nightmare, he would not have sunk into it. Instead, he would have started to have another bizarre dream. Those officers with mysterious identities did not send him to the secret court for trial and then lock him up for life. They also did not execute the military regulations and execute a secret execution. Instead, they directly released him. However, before he was released, the brown-haired officer's gentle but cold warning was like a basin of ice water that woke him up from his helpless state. The sound of footsteps outside the room made Yu jump in fright. Thinking back to his experiences over the past year, only then did he understand that the bizarre dream was still just a nightmare. Just like the disgusting curly brown hair of the officer who pushed open the door and entered. It is extremely difficult to find a place within the Federation that can completely block the light of the charter. The Federation officer walked into the room. After sitting on the chair, he removed the military cap from his head and carefully placed it beside his hand. He then rubbed his head full of curly brown hair and said with a calm voice, "With our abilities, even in this primitive underground cave, we can only block it for a few days. You've wasted a lot of time. I was forced to take the risk to come this time. This makes me feel extremely bad." Yu raised his head and looked at him with a somewhat deranged gaze. His voice was hoarse as he said, "You bunch of lunatics, murderers, so you also know fear. Are you worried that the Bureau of Proclamation will find out that you have met me before? A little, but not a lot. In the end, the glory of the Charter is controlled by humans. Even if the Bureau of Proclamation can find me, without direct evidence, they can't bring up any charges against me. They can't even begin to suspect me. Just like this isolated room 60 meters underground. Apart from the chips behind our necks, there are no other components that can send out electronic information. We pay more attention to the spirit and procedures of the Federation than anyone else. The glory of the Charter has protected the Federation for tens of thousands of years. Presumably, it will also condone the actions of us, the subjects of the Federation." Yu looked at him with a numb expression and said, "You can directly kill me. Details determine success or failure," the brown-haired officer said. The brown-haired officer said, "Due to some unexpected circumstances, this investigation is being conducted. This investigation may endanger our cause, so I need your final cooperation to end this investigation. These somewhat heavy stories need the death of you, the last seed of the Empire, to put a full stop to this. I'm not some bullshit seed. Yu shouted angrily at the other party, his facial features somewhat distorted in agitation. More than a year ago, we've already discussed this issue many times. I don't want to continue this discussion, the brown-haired officer said coldly. There was a long silence in the gloomy room, and then the sound of water dripping clearly rang out. Yu lowered his head in pain and hugged his body as if he was afraid of the cold. In this period of more than a year, he had obtained a lot of secret information from the hands of these mysterious soldiers. Moreover, under their arrangements, he had entered Bermuda and made contact with the people of the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency. He had done many things that he could never have imagined before. He had originally thought that the federal military had allowed him to live because they wanted to use his identity as a seed of the Empire to pass on false information to the Empire and sow discord. Who could have known that the truth was actually more cruel than he had imagined? I agreed to pass on information to the Empire because I convinced myself that I shouldn't care about betraying the Empire's interests. I shouldn't care about the lives of those bullshit compatriots because I don't think I'm a person of the Empire at all. When I was still a baby, I was heartlessly abandoned here by them. Why should I fight for them? Yu raised his head and allowed the tears to flow freely on his pained expression. He roared angrily, "No. In reality, it was only because I wanted to let myself believe that I was still a citizen of the Federation, a soldier of the Federation, and that I was fighting for the interests of the Federation. My family, my friends, my colleagues, the first woman I fell in love with, the history I was most interested in, the stars I liked the most, the scenic spots I liked to visit the most, all of them belonged to the Federation. I am a person from the inside out. I belong to the Federation. My life has been spent here. I have a family, I have a wife, I have children." Yu said with a sorrowful voice, "Except for this body, this flesh and blood. But the information I passed on to the Empire had nothing to do with sowing discord at all. Instead, it led to the death of Commander Zhong." He hugged his head with both hands and looked at the brown-haired officer in disbelief and pain as he yelled, "What did you do? What did you want to do? Who is the traitor? Who is the seed of the Empire?" Yuyu's eyes wandered as he subconsciously muttered, "I am not, you are. You and those shameless big shots behind you are the seeds of evil." Chapter 578. Evil. What is evil? Before the great, glorious, and correct laws of history, there is no evil. There is only the respectable darkness behind the light. The brown-haired officer's voice suddenly rose like an angry waterbird. The feathers on the top of his head stood up in fear, and his slender neck made the air flow through it become sharp. In the sharp tone, there was unmistakable contempt and disdain. The waterbird that stepped on the green water grass was looking down at the shellfish below. His words revealed the firmness and pride in his heart, as well as the narcissism that spread from it. In the dark underground room, there seemed to be a light whose color could not be seen. It enveloped the body of this federal officer whose hands were stained with blood, causing his dark green military uniform to sparkle. Only a strong and powerful Central Federation that has the support of all parties can defeat the Empire and lead us to victory. In order to achieve this goal, many people must be eliminated, including the stubborn warlord Zhong Suahu who destroyed the unity of the Federation. Perhaps it was because of Yuyu's questioning before his death that made the brown-haired officer feel the anger of his ideals being misunderstood. With a gloomy voice, he said the first part of the sentence with disdain and a hint of excitement. Yuyu's face was pale, and his eyes were cloudy and lifeless. He stared at the brown-haired officer who was waving his arms excitedly in the shadows before him. Suddenly, He laughed somewhat nervously and murmured in a low voice, "Is defeating the Empire really that important? This is a matter of life and death, a question that is higher than life and death." In the shadows, the brown-haired officer's nose bridge was high like a sharp sword. He said coldly, "The Empire is a primitive, bloody, and shameless existence. It should have been thrown into the garbage heap of the history of the universe a long time ago. Since you can't change it on your own, let us do it. We are not invaders." The officer said with a heavier tone, "What we need to do is to rescue the people of the lower class of the Empire and let the light of the Constitution cover the entire universe. Humanity will return to peace and have ample time and energy to advance into the depths of the universe. This beautiful and harmonious new era is our historical mission. For this historical mission, anyone can be sacrificed, and any means can be allowed. The question is, do the people of the lower class of the Empire need you? Do they crave for you to rescue them?" He leaned against the cold wall, his eyes still devoid of life, but gradually, he finally understood some things. "We just want to do this. We don't need the consent or understanding of the lower class of the Imperium. Our civilization is advanced and superior, so we have the responsibility to help them." The brown-haired officer said coldly, "If we don't persist in doing the right thing just because the other party can't understand it, that would be an irresponsible attitude. The Federation is superior to the Empire because of its charter, rule of law, and the spirit of freedom. What about you? You assassinated the commander of the Federation, sold information to the Empire, and threatened me with the lives of my wife and daughter. My daughter is only 4 years old this year." Hiyu's eyes widened as he angrily reprimanded, "In order to win, in order to eliminate those people who are above the law, who are not on the same path as you, you did not hesitate to destroy this spirit and put yourself above the law. What's the difference between you and the people you hate? What right do you have to talk about the injustice of saving the Empire?" These fanatical Federation officers reminded him and woke him up. It turned out that being a citizen of the Empire was not a natural sin. There were sins that were born for various reasons everywhere in this universe. There was a deathly silence in the gloomy underground room. After a long time, the brown-haired officer in the shadows said with a slightly hoarse voice, "So, in the future, we will also be swept into the trash heap of history, but," then he raised his head and said proudly and coldly, "But no matter who writes history in the future, they cannot deny that our actions have pushed this history forward and made our own contributions. We do not fight for days and nights, but only for 10,000 years." In Hiyu's eyes, the pride of the brown-haired Federation officer from the bottom of his heart and his expression of martyrdom were just ridiculous fanaticism and excitement. "Crazy, everyone has gone crazy. The world laughs at me for being too crazy, and I laugh at the world for not being able to see through it. Actually, when will I be able to truly see through it?" The brown-haired Federation officer lowered his head for an instant and then raised his head again. Still calm and graceful, there was pride in his confidence. He looked at Hiyu and said with a smile, "When we sent you to Bermuda, you could have tried to escape to the Empire, but you did not." Hiyu's body stiffened slightly. Thinking of the meeting with the Commissioner of the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency and his mental struggle at that time, he could not help but clench his fists and sink into the painful memories. "But you did not escape because you could not bear to leave your wife and daughter behind. You were worried about what would happen to them after you escaped." The brown-haired officer smiled and praised, "In this aspect, I admire you very much. For a citizen of the Empire to have the courage to give up the chance to survive for the sake of his family in the Federation." Hiyu did not say anything. He lowered his head in silence, thinking of his wife and daughter. He was depressed and sad. He did not know if they would live well after his death. He did not know if they would be able to learn of his death. He did not know if Roos would be able to open that little shop next year. He did not know if his daughter would be able to carry slippers for other men when she grew up. He did not know what would happen to everything he cared about and loved after his death. He did not know at all. It is very difficult for me to trust people as shameless as you, but other than trusting your promise, there is no other way. He lowered his head and said, "Speak, what do you want me to do in the end? Don't forget, you promised me to let them live. It's very simple, end this matter." The brown-haired officer handed over a simple recording pen and a simple black pistol. He took the recording pen, but he did not pick up the pistol. He stared in a daze at the black metal pistol on the table. His gaze rose again and fell on the faintly discernible brown hair and straight nose of the officer across from him in the shadows. A few minutes later, there was the sound of a gunshot. The forest on the ground was already dusk. When Shimin-Jin crawled out from the pile of old leaves, what entered his eyes was a red that covered the sky and covered the earth. It was just like the flower of blood that had just burst out from Hiyuyu's forehead. After a slight pause, he leaned against a large tree. He took off his brown wig and lit a cigarette. Looking at the setting sun in the distance and the military prison building in the evening light, he was silent for a long time and sighed slightly. In the end, Hiyu did not pick up the gun and shoot at him. That guy should be a good person. Fortunately, he did not have a family. Otherwise, if it was up to him to choose, between the despair and hatred before death and the safety of his wife and daughter, he really would not know which to choose. Shimin-Jin took a deep drag of the cigarette and thought in the light green smoke. He sat down and leaned against the large tree. He opened the workbench in his hand and quickly operated with his fingers. He turned the relevant information on the computer and the document with Hiyuyu's electronic signature into fragments of information and sent them out into space. From the beginning, they had never thought of killing Hiyu. Hiyu was a seat of the empire in their hands. Furthermore, through Zhongshohu's death, he would win the boundless trust of the empire. For the Federation, this meant an unimaginable amount of benefits. However, they never thought that there would be someone in this world who could surpass the authority of the Bureau of Proclamation and know that they had hidden a seed of the empire. Furthermore, this matter was exposed. Shimin-Jin's brows were deeply furrowed. He pondered bitterly in the twilight and green smoke. According to the information from the Bureau of Proclamation, Sulu had the first sequence authority. The question was, how could he have such a high sequence authority? A burst of rapid footsteps and thunderous roars interrupted his thoughts. Don't move. Put your hands up. Don't move. More than 20 fully armed and murderous Federation soldiers appeared at the edge of the forest as if they had descended from the sky. They held all kinds of weapons in their hands and surrounded Shimin-Jin in the middle. These clearly well-trained elite soldiers completely controlled the situation as soon as they appeared. However, for some reason, they were still roaring with stern expressions. They seemed to be very nervous. On the contrary, Shimin-Jin, who was surrounded, still had a calm expression. He still held the half-burned cigarette between his fingers. The calmness was just a facade. It was because he was very familiar with this group of soldiers that he could forcefully suppress the shock in his heart and pretend to be indifferent. The Iron 7th Division's Special Guards Battalion, Shimin-Jin's most direct subordinates in the past, actually pointed their guns at him today. Don't move. The commander of the Iron 7th Division Special Guards Battalion held the Pan-Ningwei submachine gun and aimed it between Shimin-Jin's eyebrows. He roared in a hoarse voice, "Battalion commander, don't move, or I'll have to shoot you." The cigarette slipped from between his fingers. Shimin-Jin lowered his head and stepped on it with his military boots. He didn't keep absolutely still according to the request of these soldiers. Instead, he raised his head and stared into the eyes of the commander. He took a step forward and asked in a deep voice, "Do you know what you are doing?" The commander of the Iron 7th Division took a step forward and pointed the cold muzzle between his eyebrows. He said in a hoarse voice, "Battalion Commander, I don't know what we are doing, but if you move one more step, I'll really have to shoot. This is the order of the division commander." The other departments in the joint investigation team of the attack on the ancient bell didn't know what was happening in the forest more than 10 kilometers away from the military prison. The officers and soldiers of the Iron 7th Division who participated in the investigation sent their arrested targets back to S1 through a military warship as fast as possible and in the most secretive way. At number 44, Shinma Avenue, Capital Special District, Du Shaoqing sat in front of his desk and looked at the relevant reports submitted by the joint investigation team with no expression on his face. Behind him, raindrops were tapping on his window, making the light inside and outside a little dim. In front of the wide desk, Shimin Jin stood with his head down. His hands were tied with high-strength plastic ropes, so he couldn't move a finger. Du Shaoqing didn't look up at him. He just looked at the report in silence. The atmosphere in the room was extremely oppressive. When the oppressive atmosphere was about to suffocate him, he looked up at Shimin Jin and said, "I told you before that there are many methods that I can't accept." Chapter 579. There was an obvious and insurmountable line between light and darkness. The ash between black and white could not be used as an excuse to absolve oneself of guilt. Even if the ash was so faint that it was almost invisible, it would still be black of varying degrees. How could it be white? The talented, cold, proud, and cool Du Shaoqing had always thought so. However, many years after he graduated from No. 1 Academy, he had been in conflict, struggling, and silent in the military system. He had changed a lot. He understood that no matter how beautiful a landscape painting was, it still needed the dirty natural pigments dug out from the dark mines to be painted. For the bright future of the Federation, or rather, for mankind, he was willing to sacrifice a part of his moral principles. Especially when a hidden and exciting trend of thought appeared in the Federation, and a trustworthy and excellent politician stood at the forefront of the trend, he was more and more sure that this sacrifice would be well rewarded. Therefore, he put all his energy and effort into the construction of the army, giving up worldly happiness such as family. Under the strong suppression of Zhong Shouhu in the West Woods, he still brought out the Iron 7th Division, an Iron Army, and branded the entire 2nd Military Region with his deep personal brand. The target of the Iron Blood Army was of course the people of the Empire, but for the future of the Federation, Du Shaoqing did not mind using this army to protect that big shot. In fact, in the past few years, his Iron 7th Division had been cooperating with the relevant departments of the government to carry out some secret plans. His most loyal subordinate, Shimin Jin, was an important contact person for the Iron 7th Division to cooperate with the relevant plans. But what was the bottom line of sacrifice? How many flowers of evil would have to be burned to let the world regain the light of holiness? How many innocent people would have to die? But, not including this. Du Shaoqing looked at Shimin Jin in front of the table expressionlessly and said in an exceptionally calm tone, "The assassination of Zhong Huiyan at Mulla Manor, you said it was the work of the Special Task Force, so I did not continue to ask. In fact, you and I both know that Qin Yinchuan secretly entered the Lin family after graduating from No. 1 Academy to carry out a secret government mission to infiltrate the 7 great families. Without my order or yours, he would not have taken the risk of exposing his identity to launch this operation." And this time, Du Shaoqing stood up after a moment of silence and said, "He shouldn't have died like this. This operation has been approved by the higher-ups." Shimin Jin lowered her head slightly and explained in a slightly hoarse voice, "Mr. Councilman, I am not willing to let you participate in these dirty matters, so I hid the specific plan from you. The last confirmed time was when you left room 5460 last time." Du Shaoqing raised his eyebrows slightly and said coldly, "Are you still my soldier?" I will always be the commander's soldier. Shimin-Jin suddenly raised her head, then standing straight, she replied loudly, but I am even more unwilling to let teacher deal with this kind of difficult problem. Difficult problem? Du Xiaoqing suddenly smiled. His smile was full of indescribable bitterness. This is not a problem. His death is like a slap to my face. It will hurt until the day I die. The final decision was made the day before Tiger returned to the West Woods. Shimin-Jin's voice was hoarse as she explained, this warlord will not give up his privileges as a noble family and join our camp. Also, in order to protect the interests of the Zhong family, the West Woods will not completely become a part of the Federation. In order to defeat the vicious enemy of the Empire, we must get rid of him. This is not a personal grudge. He gritted his teeth and looked at his teacher who was deep in thought. His tone was urgent as he said, this is for the Federation. Du Xiaoqing's usually emotionless eyes suddenly flashed with a trace of nostalgia. His thin lips opened slightly and he said slowly, for the Federation, this is a very familiar phrase. Back then, in No. 1 Academy, he liked to say this. At the time, I thought it was ridiculous. You will be a local tyrant in the West Woods. What right do you have to tarnish such a hot-blooded phrase? Now, he has really died for the Federation. You are in charge of this investigation, so no one will know the truth of the matter. Shimin-Jin noticed that his teacher's mood was a bit strange at this time. His expression was gloomy as he said, I am not fighting for anything for myself. It is just that if I am found, many people will suspect you. For all the officers and soldiers of the Iron 7th Division, their object of loyalty was the Federation. To be more specific, direct, and firm, it was their teacher Du Xiaoqing. Even though Shimin-Jin, who worked for some important people in the government, hid many things about Du Xiaoqing, in fact, he still fanatically worshipped him. Everything he did pointed to the direction of creating a bright and open dance in the Federation. Under the leadership of his teacher, they would advance into the depths of the universe and conquer a large star region. I don't plan to expose this matter because too many people are involved. Once the truth is exposed, the West Woods will definitely be in chaos. The first civil war in the Federation may break out. When that time comes, how can the chaotic Federation defeat the Empire? Du Xiaoqing said coldly, I am not a perfect person with perfect morals. Whether it is the senator or you all want to put on a pair of white gloves for me, but the hands are already black and can never be clean again. I cannot bear the responsibility of starting a civil war in the Federation, and I am no longer a young man who can't sleep because of his conscience. I don't like Tiger Zhong even more, so it seems that I have no reason to continue investigating. Du Xiaoqing slowly opened the drawer and then walked to the front of the table. Outside the window, the rain dripped. The light in the room was dim, and the smooth military uniform gradually changed color with his steps. But he shouldn't have died like this. A strange flush flashed across Du Xiaoqing's usually cold face. He stared at Shimin-Jin in front of him and roared in a low voice, he is a soldier of the Federation, a truly outstanding soldier of the Federation. He should have been killed on a real battlefield, or he could have been killed in the valiant civil war of the Federation, but he shouldn't have been killed by the bullets of his comrades in the back because of a mistake that he hadn't committed yet. A crisp spring sound rang out. Du Xiaoqing raised the pistol and pointed it between Shimin-Jin's brows. He said coldly, today, I'll kill you first to return him alive. In the future, when I capture the Emperor of the Empire, I'll return him alive. At that time, we'll meet again in hell. In the depths of the desk drawer behind him, that old-fashioned photo lay quietly. The back was facing up, and the front was kissing the dust. Under the cold black barrel of the gun, Shimin-Jin's face was pale, but he didn't move at all. He still stood extremely straight and didn't make any movements to dodge. Only his breathing became hurried. Right at this moment, there was a knock on the door. Knock, knock, knock. It was extremely stable. Du Shaoqing's right hand, which was holding the gun steadily, stiffened slightly. This building was filled with his soldiers. Who was able to quietly come to his door in the middle of a rainy day? The person outside the door didn't wait for the person inside to react. He pushed the door open naturally and entered. His slightly chubby body was wrapped in a raincoat, and the action of closing the door seemed to be somewhat strenuous. This person took off the wet raincoat and threw it on the ground. He then took off the hat that was drenched in the rain and hung it on the clothes rack beside the door. He rubbed his hands lightly, turned around, looked at the two people in front of the table, and said with a smile, "It said that autumn rain is cold, but it's still summer now. After being drenched in the rain, it's terrifyingly cold. What the hell is this weather?" At this time, Du Shaoqing was still pointing the gun between Shimin Jin's eyebrows. Because of the arrival of this uninvited guest, he didn't pull the trigger, but his slightly stiff right arm was still raised horizontally. He didn't put it down. Taking off the wet hat, it was white hair. This old man who entered Du Shaoqing's office like he was going home didn't seem to see the tense situation in the room, nor did he see the gun in the air. He looked at Du Shaoqing and said with a hint of admonishment, "Being able to have such a subordinate who thinks for you in all aspects and doesn't even hide when facing your gun proves your ability to lead troops. Isn't it also your luck? You should cherish such a subordinate, and not die because of a moment of impulse and rare lack of calmness. Otherwise, in the future, you will definitely doubt yourself and feel sad like you are now." Du Shaoqing's eyes slightly lowered, but he still didn't put down the gun in his hand. The old man with white hair ignored him and said calmly, "Let's start the meeting. Although I'm very unwilling to take over this work, since His Excellency the President asked me to handle all the specific matters of this investigation, I have to care about it." Du Shaoqing's sword-like eyebrows slightly twitched, and blue veins appeared. He finally put down the gun in his hand and said in a heavy tone, "Yes, Mr. Vice President." Vice President Byron of the Federation convened the first joint meeting of the Joint Investigation Team of the attack on the Antique Bell. Because it was called at the last minute, the director of the Investigation Department of the Federation and the officers of the other two departments couldn't attend in time. They just received a briefing after the meeting. Very few people attended this joint meeting. Few people could imagine that the first meeting of the Joint Investigation Team actually became a gathering of the culprits of this conspiracy. This was an absurd and extremely cold fact. The association hasn't had a gathering for many years. Vice President Byron, who was sitting in the middle of the bench, said, "But I don't enjoy this kind of gathering, because I feel uneasy when I think that the Bureau of Proclamation may know every word we say." In the dim room, a voice sounded, "Although Cui Zedong had issued a warning in advance, we still didn't expect Su Li's unexpected situation to happen. I'm really shocked that this person's sequence authority is actually higher than Cui Zedong's, and he can even make the charter computer restart the investigation." Vice President Byron leaned forward slightly, and light and shadow interlaced on his old face. He said in a heavy voice, "Even if Su Lo has the first sequence authority, according to the privacy protection regulations of citizens, he can't have access to certain content. How on earth did he bypass the regulations?" Cui Zedong tried to find the reason before he was replaced, but he didn't find anything. Also, according to the information from the interrogation room, he was preparing to commit suicide. There was silence in the dim room. The person who was about to become the director of the Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation, and in a sense, the most powerful man, didn't hesitate to commit suicide when facing the interrogation. This shocked everyone present. I strongly disagree with this. His position in the Bureau of Proclamation is very important to our plan. Although I admire his courage, this is not the best way to solve the problem. Chapter 580. The gloomy room was incomparably quiet. These figures hidden in the darkness were most likely all important figures in the Federation. However, other than Vice President Byron, who was sitting at the head of the table, no one else could be seen clearly. Many years ago, this loose organization had already existed. At first, it was just a high-level association that focused on the exchange of academic knowledge. Later on, without anyone noticing, it secretly relaxed the standards for joining the association. It gradually began to have specific goals and became incomparably powerful. The association was incomparably powerful because every single one of its members was extremely powerful. These members who could call the wind and summon the rain in different areas of the Federation possessed intelligence and abilities that ordinary people could not imagine. Just like the wind, clouds, thunder, and lightning at the top of the dome of heaven, once gathered together, they would release extremely terrifying energy. Only this group of people dared to weave such a conspiracy with no expression on their faces. Only this group of people dared to borrow the power of the Empire to murder a Federation commander. In the entire plan, they had made meticulous arrangements for all possible contingencies. They had even noticed the problem of Su Li's sequence authority changing. However, everyone, including Cui Zedong, had still underestimated the severity of this problem. As a result, they had paid a disastrous price. Cui Zedong was the future director of the Bureau of Proclamation and the most important member of the association. Now that he was under investigation, in order to protect him, someone in the association had to sacrifice themselves without hesitation. That a day later, a clear gunshot rang out from a certain room on the top floor of the Federation's Department of Defense building. A few years ago, in an adjacent room, a clear gunshot had also rang out. That day, the former Deputy Minister of the Department of Defense, Yang Jingsong, had committed suicide in anger because of the assassination at the Linhai State Gymnasium. He had left behind an angry will. The one who had committed suicide today was the director of the Department of Defense's Office No. 1, who was also the personal secretary of Minister Zhou Yingxing, Lieutenant Colonel Zhao. Secretary Zhao had also left behind a will. Minister of Defense Zhou Yingxing looked at Secretary Zhao, who had collapsed in a pool of blood. He slowly took off his glasses, lowered his head, and pinched the space between his eyebrows. He then handed the will in his hand to the officer beside him. In his last words, Secretary Zhao admitted that he had used the electronic code in the minister's office without permission and forged a secret military intelligence plan. He requested the Bureau of Proclamation to cooperate and temporarily stop the investigation of the seed of the Empire. As for why he had done so, there was no answer in his last words. At this point, the investigation of the attack on the ancient Bell ship had finally made a breakthrough, but it was also put to an end by the cold death of this person. Cui Zedong, the assistant director of the Bureau of Proclamation, was cleared of most of the suspicion and left the investigation camp that night. What awaited him was an extremely long vacation. Minister Zhou Yingxing stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in his office and looked down at the capital special district. He was silent for a long time. His hands were behind his back, and he seemed to feel the blood stains from Secretary Zhao's suicide note between his fingers. In just one day, he seemed to have aged a lot. Both his body and spirit had suffered an extremely heavy blow. Secretary Zhao had been following him since he was the head of the department in the General Assembly base. The relationship between the two had long surpassed the relationship between a superior and a subordinate. However, who would have thought that this person had other intentions in his heart? Today, it was even more dismal. They are very powerful, and they are gradually becoming more powerful. Minister Zhou looked at the heavy rain outside the window expressionlessly and muttered to himself, "Who can stop them? Or should we stop them?" Over the years, the hardliners within the Federation government and the military were gradually rising. In the deepest undercurrent, there was even an extremely dangerous tendency of the military to interfere in the political affairs. Zhong Shouhu had noticed this serious problem, and Zhou Yingxing had naturally smelled this trace of smell. He could even vaguely guess who the other party was. However, he did not have enough evidence, nor did he have the power to change anything. Because he did not know the real attitude of the president's residents and the people in Philadelphia toward this kind of ideology, West Woods region, Sunset State. Dozens of dark green military vehicles were connected in front and back, moving slowly and silently on the streets. The red and white military license plates hanging on the vehicles were now covered by thick black gauze, allowing the people of the West Woods on the streets to guess the origin of this motorcade. There was no rushing to tell others, no joy, no sobbing. The people of the West Woods stood in the windows of the buildings, in the bushes by the streets, and in the back of the small trucks, silently and sorrowfully watching the silent and sorrowful motorcade drive toward the old house in Latitude 2 district. In addition to the silence and sorrow, there was also endless frustration and emptiness that pervaded the streets and alleys. The little princess of the West Woods had finally returned home, but under such circumstances. Although the little girl in the motorcade had inherited the proud bloodline of the Zhong family, she was still a little girl. How could her thin and timid shoulders bear so much pressure? In the back of the bulletproof military vehicle, Fatty Tian looked at the little girl beside him and said gently, "Don't sleep. Watch TV for a while. We're almost there." This strong man, who had been retired for many years, naturally took over the heavy responsibility of taking care of the little princess of the Zhong family. Perhaps it was because of the pressure and anger that caused him to overeat, he appeared to be fatter than before. His eyes were slightly narrowed, like the cracks on a white wall. There was no mischievous or comical expression in those cracks, only cold and valiant. Zhong Huiyan's eyes were actually not as big as Su Lu remembered, but they were unusually bright and fresh. She sat quietly in the back seat, and under her black hair that slowly rose and fell like a watermelon skin, there was a trace of melancholy and sorrow that did not match her age in her lovely crescent-like eyes. "I don't want to watch TV. It's all about father's documentaries." She bit her lip and said stubbornly, "Those are all fake." Immediately, she lowered her head weakly and stared blankly at the doll in her arms that was so old that it was about to break off. Her clear and childish voice trembled slightly, and her eyes were red as she said, "They all lied to me and said that they would take me home to see rabbits. Now that I'm back, where are they? Brother Sula promised me that Mom would be back soon, but now, even he can't come back." The little girl turned her head sadly, and her shoulders trembled slightly. She was like a sensitive girl who was too proud and mature to show her true emotions to others. Only when she tilted her head slightly and gently rubbed her cheek against the old doll did she reveal her true age. Mr. Tian silently looked at the back of the little girl, took a deep breath silently, and turned his head to the other side of the car window. He looked at the remaining burn marks on the car window, and a trace of palpitating emotion flashed across his round face. He took out his phone and asked in a deep voice, "Where are you?" "Just ahead." Traffic control had already been carried out on the straight streets of the capital of Sunset State. The dark green military vehicle steadily moved forward under the complicated gazes of the West Woods citizens. At this moment, a series of heavy mechanical rumbles suddenly sounded in front of the streets, and the vibrations caused the leaves on the streets to begin to tremble. Hundreds of armored vehicles surged in from all directions and quickly approached the military vehicles. The earth trembled. The two sides met in an extremely short period of time, and the order was extremely good. However, the overwhelming aura of iron still made the onlookers feel an uncontrollable panic. At this time, the dark green fleet finally tore off the exterior of the tarpaulin camouflage. The heavy firepower weapons in the rear compartments of dozens of military vehicles were clearly visible, displaying their power without any concealment. The thick, cold, black metal pipes were vigilantly aimed at the sky, the ground, and every corner of the streets. The heavily guarded fleet moved forward 3 kilometers, and another 70 or so black MX mechas of the latest model joined the fleet with a roar. Forward, forward, forward. The silent and valiant army escorted the little girl in the center of the fleet as they moved forward toward the old mansion in Way 2 District. At the same time, the 2 reorganized machinists stationed in the southwest military camp of the capital of Sunset State had already left their station. They silently, brazenly, and murderously entered the city. Tens of thousands of fully armed soldiers, thousands of various war vehicles, and hundreds of heavy alloy mechas became an irresistible iron stream, paralyzing the entire city's traffic and daily operations. Immediately after, the reorganized machinist master announced on behalf of a certain party that from that day onward, the capital of Sunset State, within a radius of 80 kilometers around the old mansion in Way 2 District, would become a military control zone. No entry without permission. The phone calls from the Westwoods office of the Department of Defense and the Westwoods Military Staff Department kept ringing, but the 2 machinists did not respond at all. Finally, these calls directly reached the dark green fleet that was slowly returning home. On the phone, the angry general sternly questioned Stick Tian what he was going to do. You know why. Stick Tian glanced at the little girl beside him, the fat on his lower jaw trembling slightly, and said, "This is for the safety of the little girl. If you don't dare to come and disarm, then pretend you didn't see this scene. I know, His Excellency the President will be here soon. I left half the city for you to prepare for the ceremony. Is there any other problem?" There was silence on the other end of the phone. No matter how angry the general was, after hearing this incomparably valiant announcement, he still could only remain silent. Because the one who said this was Fatty Tian. Even though this Fatty Tian had long retired from the army, even though he was only a colonel when he retired, he could still command the military strength of 3 divisions with just one phone call. No one in the Westwoods dared to doubt this. After Stick Tian hung up the phone, he shook his head. He was not used to being arrogant, and letting 3 machinists ignore the military order of the Federation and enter the city in large numbers had long exceeded the meaning of arrogance on the surface. But he had to do this. Only in this way could those who had bad intentions be more honest. The commander was dead, so the little girl could return to the Westwoods. This was very sad and very infuriating. But what was even more sad and infuriating was that on the way home, in the space station at the border of the region, they actually encountered an accident that was definitely not an accident. If the Special Task Force staff sent by the president had not gotten the relevant information, things might have been a little troublesome. He glanced at Zhong Huiyan, somewhat clumsily picked up the school bag beside her, and said, "Do you still have to do homework today?" Zhong Huiyan turned her head, and there was no expression on her young face. She nodded and said, "Yes, I have to study harder in the future, because I have to take care of myself." Chapter 581. Stop. In a quiet and noble manner on the outskirts of the capital of the Westwoods Sunset State, a cold shout rang out. On both sides of the road under the cover of the trees, black gun barrels poked out and aimed at a few soldiers who were walking quickly along the road. In the face of the tight defense and deadly weapons, the soldiers did not stop at all. Even the determined expression on their faces did not change. They followed the burly figure at the front and approached the building. The few of them were not imposing, but they were as firm as a mountain. Li Feng's footsteps were firm. His military boots were shiny, and his military uniform was neat. There was no expression on his face, but there was a sense of ruthlessness between his eyebrows that made people's hearts palpitate. Hundreds of fully armed personnel rushed out from under the building hidden among the green trees, blocking in front of him and his subordinates. The black barrels of the guns were closer, but Li Feng didn't even look at these people. He waved his right hand and forcefully pushed away the barrels of the guns. He walked in with loud strides. Inside the building, the Zhong family was holding an extremely important meeting. The elders of the family and the people with real power needed to determine the distribution of power after the unexpected death of the head of the family as soon as possible. They needed to stabilize the internal situation and seek for the longevity of the family. However, Li Feng, an outsider, barged into the meeting without reason. Under the disbelieving gazes of the well-dressed people, he walked directly to the deepest part of the room. An old man of the Zhong family who was presiding over the meeting slowly stood up and frowned. He was about to say something, but his old and cloudy eyes suddenly shrank. Li Feng walked in front of the hesitant Zhong Ziki with an expressionless face. He took out the old-style gun at his waist. Without the slightest hesitation or a word, he directly pulled the trigger at Zhong Ziki's thigh. The crisp sound of the gunshot reverberated in the quiet meeting room, but it shook everyone's mind. Their ears were buzzing, and their minds were in chaos. There was absolute silence. There seemed to be no sound of tables and chairs overturning, no sound of Zhong Ziki screaming and falling to the ground, no sound of blood spurting out from his thigh. There was only the sound of a gunshot. This simple and straightforward gunshot shattered everyone's ability to think. The entire Federation referred to this young lieutenant colonel as Mad Manly, because he was insufferably arrogant and crazy in battle, but no one thought that he was a true madman, until now. He walked in with his chest puffed out and pulled out his pistol expressionlessly. As if he was waving his hand to swat away a fly, he pulled the trigger without hesitation and shot the second young master, who was most likely to become the head of the Westwoods Zhong family, to the ground. The silence was broken by cries of surprise, curses, and shouts. The security personnel of the Zhong family in the Westwoods rushed over, roaring with heavy weapons in their hands, but no one dared to shoot, and no one dared to stand in front of Zhong Ziki. This was because Li Feng was still holding a gun in his broad right hand. His light yellow calluses were firmly in contact with the patterned gun handle. The distance between the slender muzzle and Zhong Ziki's forehead was so short that even a needle couldn't penetrate it. There was another important reason why there wasn't an intense gunfight or a bloodbath. Zhong Ziki was clutching his thigh as he fell to the ground. His face was pale from the pain, and his facial features were contorted. His eyes were filled with horror, but he still didn't forget to shout loudly, "Don't shoot." He knew Mad Manly very well. Even if the Zhong family security personnel blasted the officers into a bloody pulp, Mad Manly would definitely rush to kill him first. What was even more terrifying was that the deafening gunshot clearly proved that if Mad Manly wanted to kill him today, he wouldn't even need to think twice. I don't want to care about the bullshit matters of you aristocratic families, but fireworks are the only flesh and blood of a tiger. Li Feng stared at Zhong Ziki's contorted face under the muzzle of the gun. He enunciated each word clearly. If something like what happened in the space station happens again, if your sister loses a single strand of hair, I don't care if you did it or not, I will kill you. I didn't do it, Zhong Ziki shouted in pain. You can insult my intelligence, but don't overestimate my rationality. I've already said that I don't care if you did it or not. I'll settle the score with you. Li Feng used the muzzle of the gun to stab Zhong Ziki's forehead as he roared, "If you want to be the head of the family, the Westwoods will be yours. In the Westwoods, if anything happens to your sister, who else would I look for if not you? I don't care what fucking evidence you have." After saying this, he put the gun back into his holster and glared at Zhong Ziki on the ground. He couldn't be bothered to say anything else. With a bang of his military boots on the ground, he prepared to turn around and leave. The Zhong family's big shots, who had been shocked and silent until this moment, finally reacted. The family elder who stood up shakily was so angry that his whole body was trembling. He pointed at the back of Li Feng's head and scolded, "How dare you? Arrest this lunatic." The Zhong family's armed men approached again with nervous expressions. A few heavy firearms even directly stuck to Li Feng's gradually losing childishness. One of the guns with a metallic luster was directly pressed against Li Feng's forehead. The soldier holding the gun had a ruthless expression. He wanted to use this action to return the humiliation that the family successor had suffered to him. His cheek made intimate contact with the cold barrel of the gun. Li Feng's eyes suddenly flashed with madness. With a muffled shout, he slammed his head against the barrel of the gun between his eyebrows. The moment he lowered his head, a huge force collided with the metal gun, causing it to suddenly change shape with a creaking sound. The hard gun butt flew backward and directly hit the soldier's chest. The ruthless soldier couldn't react at all. Accompanied by the terrifying sound of his sternum cracking, he directly fainted. A micro-controlled gun can't even fake a misfire. Li Feng fiercely spat. He suddenly turned around and looked at the Zhong family's big shots. He rolled his eyes and said, "What I just said to Zhong Ziki is also what I said to you old men. If anything happens to Zhong Huiyan in the West Woods again, you all will be buried with her." He stretched out his arrogant index finger and pointed at the old man of the Zhong family, who was covering his chest and coughing. He said, "You old dogs only know how to hide behind a tiger and pick up rotten meat to eat. Since you don't dare to kill me because of my old man, then be more honest in the future. You must be very eager for my old man to die early so that you can deal with me. But I have to remind you that when the day comes that you dare to kill me, maybe I will be very willing to kill all of you in advance." Li Feng's face was ferocious. He looked around at the several generations of elites of the Zhong family and said coldly, "So you'd better pray that my old man will live forever, or that Zhong Huiyan will always be healthy." The expressions of the people of the Zhong family were extremely complicated and embarrassed. They had to admit that what Li Feng said was true. For these thousand-year-old families, the Li family by Lake Feiqing was just the condensation of brilliance that occasionally bloomed in the long river of history. However, in the past few decades, the Li family, which was sparsely populated, had become more powerful than the 7 families because the highest mountain in the Federation was still spreading light and shadow in the universe. The military boots stepped on the ground paved with precious stones, making clear and firm footsteps. Li Feng walked out of the venue indifferently with his subordinate officers. His voice was not loud today, but when it gushed out from his burly and magnificent chest, it was as deafening as heavenly thunder. Until his back disappeared at the door, these words still echoed in the venue and fell on the heavy hearts of people on the ground, smashing countless bloody holes. Just like Zhong Ziki's miserable thigh, the most important thing in the world was life and death, and the most common thing was also life and death. When an ordinary person died, it would often make the hearts of relatives linger in grief for a few days, while the unrelated people would only care about their own happiness. But the death of a big shot was different. The length of the human mourning seemed to be proportional to the weight of the dead person. The sudden death of Zhong Suohu and his wife, in addition to triggering thoughts of mourning in the Federation and the continuous sad weather in the West Woods for many days, would inevitably lead to more complicated and more serious problems because they left behind a jaw-dropping legacy, including the huge industrial cluster of the ancient clock company, but more importantly, the right of the head of the Zhong family to dispose of the family property and the military power of the West Woods. Tacitly acknowledged by the Federation. So far, no will had been found, so how should the legacy be dealt with? 2 partners of the largest law firm in the West Woods chose to resign because they could not bear the huge pressure. The West Woods troops in several galaxies were also anxiously watching. According to the laws of the Federation, the only daughter of Commander Zhong and his wife, Zhong Huohua, had the unquestionable right of first inheritance. But the problem was that the legacy could not be inherited completely according to the laws of the Federation to a large extent. For example, the exercise of military power was not allowed by the Federation laws at all. Also, the family property of the Zhong family that had existed for thousands of years, the head of the family had the absolute right to dispose of it, but it did not mean that it was the personal property of the head of the family. How could these troublesome legacies, which made the relationship between the Federation and the West Woods, be inherited by a little girl? At this time, many people in the West Woods thought of Zhong Ziki, the nephew who was most doted on and even spoiled by Commander Zhong, and in the hearts of many people over the years, the next head of the family. Gradually, there was a great difference of opinion between the Zhong family and the troops, and cracks were gradually forming. In the face of such a crazy legacy, all kinship, love, and friendship were all bubbles, and all kinds of tricks were possible. Fortunately, Li Feng used his madness and Big Stick Tian used his strength to suppress this trend before the frightening and dangerous situation descended into total madness. The people and soldiers of the West Woods anxiously waited for the result. The continuous heavy rain carried the cold wind through countless tall buildings. At this time, the president of the Federation, Mr. Pabre, arrived in the Sunset State of the West Woods region. The funeral was about to begin. Chapter 582. The melodious military music gradually stopped, and the crisp sound of gunshots echoed in the air, shuttling through the dense raindrops, startling the birds that were grooming their wet feathers around the square. It seemed that the weather during a funeral was always bad, and the cold rain was like God crying. In the cold rain, President Pabre's speech in front of the battlefield cemetery was probably the only warm color. His speech touched many people, comforted many people, and made many people cry. After the West Woods Tiger's funeral ended, the president did not rest. He immediately met with the real power figures of the Zhong family and had lunch with them. In the middle of the night, he summoned Big Stick Tian and a couple of young officers from Silan's military. The meeting lasted an entire 3 hours. The next day, 2 of the 3 divisions of mechanics that forced their way into the capital of Sunset State and announced that they were under military control retreated back to the military camp. The old house in Latitude 2 district finally opened its door again. The people who had received some kind of promise from the president chose to compromise in peace. After President Pabre's tireless mediation, the situation in the West Woods that was about to explode finally eased. To ensure the stability of the West Woods, the Zhong family, whose people were unstable, had to be appeased. Some interests could be sacrificed, and some limits could be compromised. After all, those interests that were compromised never really belonged to the Federation government. The Federation would never give a clear suggestion on who would inherit the Zhong family's huge family business. They only showed a slight inclination in the dark. For a long time in the future, the fight for the Zhong family's property would become more complicated. It would definitely be brought to court, and it would be a grand and long-lasting battle. There would be an uproar, and there would be a lot of ugliness. However, as long as the military was not used and the matter was resolved in a relatively peaceful way, it would not affect the Federation's rare goods situation, and it would not affect the galactic war that was about to start, then it would be fine. Compared to the ownership of the Gu Zhong Company and those industrial clusters, the real problem was the selection of the commander of the West Woods military region. The Zhong family had controlled the military power in the West Woods for thousands of years, and this was their biggest reliance and bottom line. Although the Zhong family, which was gradually splitting up, needed the support of the Federation government, they would not give up this bottom line. Perhaps he could seize this opportunity to change some things. The people of the West Woods would never agree to let Du Shaoqing serve in the West Woods military headquarters, so who should they send? President Pabre stood silently by the window, looking at the blue sky, silver sand under his feet and the drizzling rain, thinking about his trip to the West Woods. The top floor of the Golden Star Hotel was silent, and the world outside was equally silent except for the sound of the rain. This planet far away from the capital ring finally had a moment of respite after that tragedy, but the most powerful man in the Federation still could not find a moment to relax. No matter what the situation is, a politician should remain absolutely calm. Only then can they ensure that they are not defeated by weakness and that their decisions are correct so that they can seek happiness and benefits for the majority of the people. I don't know if it's because of Commander Zhong's funeral. President Pobre said in a deep voice as he looked at the rain outside the glass curtain wall and the faint reflection of the shadows. A hand gently patted his left shoulder, and the president's wife comforted him. Sometimes there is no other way to make some compromises. President Pobre knew that his wife must have misunderstood that he was frustrated because he decided to support the other side of the Zhong family. He could not help but smile bitterly, gently patted the warm hand on his shoulder, and whispered to himself in a low voice, "Sometimes the sacrifices we are forced to make may be far more serious than compromises." The president's wife looked at his back worriedly and found that her husband seemed to be in a bad mood, so she quickly changed the topic and said quickly, "My daughter called again yesterday. She is very concerned about Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's situation. How should I answer?" President Pobre thought of his daughter who was still troubled by depression, and thought of the young man whose fate was unknown. A trace of sadness flashed across his tanned face, and he said in a sincere tone, "I can only pray for that guy's good luck." It was also raining in the capital special district of S1. Teacher Du Xiaoqing watched the live broadcast of the funeral with a somewhat complicated expression. After a long time of silence in the dark room, he walked to the bookshelf, took down the violin case, and began to play the violin. The refreshing violin melody became somewhat different in the hands that were no longer stable and were slightly trembling. The notes that were flowing, struggling, and colliding in the space gathered together and then separated resolutely, revealing a faint sadness, deep panic, and speechless confusion. The emotions were extremely complicated. The melody stopped without warning. Du Xiaoqing stared blankly at the green leaves outside the window that were being tormented by the heavy rain. His usual straight posture seemed to be somewhat stooped. His military posture, which had never had anything wrong with it, seemed to be somewhat gloomy. He suddenly roared and smashed the expensive violin hard on the window lattice, smashing the glass into pieces and splashing everywhere like rain. That night, Du Xiaoqing hastily wrote a report of the preliminary investigation results, and at the same time attached his resignation letter to the office of the president's residence, suggesting that the Parliament Hill continue to investigate the attack of the ancient bell. In the early morning of the next day, he returned to S3 with several orderlies to prepare for the war with the Empire. As long as the situation in the West Woods was stabilized, the federal forces would launch a large-scale attack on the Empire. After the Empire shamelessly attacked the ancient bell, no force or faction in the Federation dared to stop the determination of the president and the military. Otherwise, the anger of the people would directly burn them to ashes. Before boarding the warship, Du Xiaoqing suddenly turned around, took off his sunglasses, and revealed his cold and proud face. He looked at the capital special district in the morning rain with a complicated expression and suddenly asked, "Is there any news from Su Lu?" Reporting to the commander, "There is no news." Du Xiaoqing put on his sunglasses again and remained silent. From the time he put on this pair of sunglasses, he was no longer so obsessed with the starry sky above his head and some things deep in his heart. Once he started to compromise, he might be forced to continue to compromise. It was this cognition that made him think of Su Lu, the young man who made him very unhappy. Now that the hardest stone in the Federation had died, it seemed to be a pity, somewhere far away from the ordinary people's living area in the Federation, there was a secluded manor deep in the mountains and blue lakes. This manor belonged to the Nanxiang family, the most low-key of the 7 families. However, looking at the manor's vast area and luxurious furnishings, how could it be considered low-key? I heard that someone from the government said that the official residence is very happy to see Zhong Ziki inherit the position of the head of the Zhong family. Nan Xiangmei clenched her fists, opened her bright eyes, and looked at her mother in shock. Her beautiful cheeks were stained with a few strands of black hair that were wet from the rain. In order to pacify the situation in the West Woods as soon as possible, Mr. President made such a hint in advance. After all, the little girl of the Zhong family is too young, and she has been living in the Shisha state, and Zhong Ziki has the support of most of the Zhong family members. Mrs. Nan looked at her daughter with a smile. She knew very well why her daughter, who insisted on living an ordinary life since childhood, suddenly came home today and raised doubts about the situation in the Federation. This was naturally because the young man had an extremely close relationship with the little princess of the Zhong family, but Zhong Huiyan is the legal heir. Nan Xiangmei shook her head in disbelief. Everyone in the West Woods knows that Commander Zhong dotes on Zhong Ziki very much. Many people see that young man as the future head of the Zhong family. In fact, in our view, that tiger seems to have some kind of intention. He wants the heir of the Zhong family to have to die in S1. In this case, the government's choice of Zhong Ziki may be in line with the tiger's last wish. I don't believe it. Nan Xiangmei shook her head firmly. The government is not a kind person, and I know that the Tai family, the Li family, and even our family have sent people to the West Woods. Everyone's reaction is very strange. After a moment of silence, Mrs. Nan calmly replied, "You're right. Zhong Ziki can't become an excellent family head in a short period of time. The Zhong family has no leader, and now there are signs of division. The government is secretly adding fuel to the fire. Maybe this is the precursor of the first collapse of the 7 families. In this case, the 6 families must be the first to enter the West Woods to seek benefits. If the Zhong family is destroyed, what good will it do to the other families?" Nan Xiangmei asked sadly, "The relationship between lips and teeth, don't the elders of the family know better than I do? The Zhong family has always been on the edge of the 7 family system. They have no marriage alliance with us, and there are no deep interests entanglement. More importantly, if the Zhong family is really going to decline, we can't just sit back and watch the government absorb the energy released when the Zhong family scatters like a black hole." Nan Xiangmei frowned, looked at her mother and said sadly, "I heard that you and Mrs. Zhong were very good friends. Can't you do something for her daughter? You don't understand, everything is for the sake of interests, for survival." Mrs. Nan slightly closed her eyes, and after a long silence, she continued, "For a giant family like the 7 families, even if they decline and collapse, it will not be a matter of a short period of time. This long process may last for a whole constitutional era. It is also possible that the Zhong family will suddenly rise halfway, just like the history of the East Woods when they were almost destroyed. But in the face of this unprecedented situation, everyone must plunge into it to seize benefits and strengthen themselves, otherwise, it may be our turn to decline next." Nan Xiangmei didn't express any more opinions on this issue, and just looked at her mother with some disappointment and sadness. She looked up and worriedly looked at her daughter, who had obviously lost a lot of weight. She knew where her disappointment and sadness came from. This was because of the love, this was because she was looking for the last bit of hope. However, Mrs. Nan didn't say anything in the end. Nan Xiangmei returned to her own small courtyard behind the lake. She sat quietly and sadly by the window, looking at the countless small circles created by the rain hitting the lake. She thought of the similar circles she saw on the pond in the forest garden that day. These days, it seemed that the entire Federation, and the land of countless planets, was raining, and the patter made people feel depressed and gloomy. Nan Xiangmei glanced at the phone in her hand and dialed a string of numbers with trembling fingertips. After getting this phone number from Li Xiaotong, she hadn't dialed it even once. Today was the first time, but there was no sound from the other end of the phone. Crystal tears fell from the front of her eyelashes, and more, forming a bead curtain and dripping to the ground. She reached out to wipe them, but more tears poured out from her fingers. Chapter 583. Mr. President personally stepped in to mediate, and the government and parliament exerted a lot of pressure. Finally, the situation in the West Woods did not get out of control. At least for the time being, the two sides of the family did not have an intense and uncontrollable armed conflict. Some of the fights that revolved around big interests dived into the depths of the sea, brewing endless pressure, while some surfaced above the blue waves and began to move toward legal solutions. Among the huge industries, including the Gu Zhong Company, which belonged to the Zhong family, and which belonged to the private property of the old mansion in the Weifang district, countless complicated legal terms and definitions of authority were enough to make the judges of the entire West Woods a headache. Many people thought that this lawsuit might go all the way to the Supreme Court. The Federation government and the military did not want to see this situation go on for too long. After all, the universe war was coming soon. The various forces faintly sent out vague messages, but it was enough for the parties involved to be very clear. These messages were not good news for the little girl in the old mansion in the Weifang district. The government hoped that the chaos in the West Woods would end as soon as possible. The military hoped that after the civil issues were resolved, they could immediately deal with the jurisdiction of the troops in the West Woods. The six families hidden in the shadows watched indifferently and waited for the aftermath of the Zhong family split. The few most powerful forces in the entire Federation pushed the situation to develop in a certain direction for different reasons. Although the Federation's judicial system was claimed to be absolutely independent, in the face of such terrifying pressure, the so-called independence could only guarantee some procedural fairness on the surface. The three jurisdictional disputes that started one after another in more than 10 days were extremely unfavorable to the old mansion of the Zhong family. The old mansion's legal counsel, those famous lawyers in the West Woods, could not help but feel a little powerless in the face of such a situation. Under such circumstances, on an ordinary street in the Sunset region in the afternoon, a law firm called Shizhou quietly opened for business. No one noticed that this law firm, which only had 3 shared offices and was not well known in the industry, only had one office. No one knew that the first business the Shizhou law firm sought after its opening was to come to the old mansion of the Zhong family in the Weifang district. If I'm not mistaken, you mean that this law firm called Shizhou wants to represent Miss Zhong Huiyan in all her legal affairs in the future? The staff of the Zhong family's old mansion looked at the young lawyer who had obviously just graduated from university. His expression was extremely strange. The young man opposite him was a little restless. He probably knew who Miss Zhong Huiyan was and what kind of situation the Zhong family was in. The other party actually wanted to represent Miss in all her legal affairs. This was a ridiculous request. Was the boss of this law firm out of his mind? Was he trying to make a name for himself with such a clown request? Do you know how many barristers serve the young lady? Do you know what kind of status these great lawyers have in the West Woods? Do you know that even the famous lawyer he from S1 is currently on his way to the West Woods? The staff member of the Zhong family looked at the young lawyer opposite him and frowned. Your law firm has just been established. What gives you the confidence to let us choose you over these famous lawyers? The young lawyer rubbed his hands nervously and explained in a trembling voice, I know. It seems to be impossible to explain. It's just that the partner of the law firm asked us to get this business. He suddenly thought of something and hurriedly took out a plant fiber business card from the inside of his clothes. He respectfully handed it over and said, We are a small law firm. The boss has no intention of recruiting partners for the time being. The staff member of the Zhong family took the expensive business card and looked at the name on it. He frowned slightly and turned to leave. In less than a minute, the staff member hurriedly came back and looked at the young lawyer in disbelief. He said, Colonel Tian said that he hopes to meet with the boss of your law firm as soon as possible. As for the matter you just mentioned, from today onwards, all the legal affairs of the old mansion will be handed over to the Shizhou law firm. Tai Yuan stood in the narrow office of the law firm and looked at the traffic outside the window. There was a smile on his thin and slightly pale face. A month ago, he came to the West Woods and quietly watched the tragedies, comedies, and clowns, but he didn't make a sound. According to the life plan that his mother had suggested and the self-awareness that he had cultivated since he was very young, he should have stayed in the army at this time to seek military exploits in the war against the Imperium in the future. Then, he should have joined the grassroots to accumulate experience and finally officially entered the political world. He should have chosen an important and symbolic state and become a member of that state. He should not have opened a small law firm in the quiet civilian district of the Sunset State as he was now. He didn't give up the first step of his life plan, to become the youngest president of the Federation in history. He just went against his mother's wishes and chose another path that might be more difficult to take. He admitted that he was indeed influenced by the life experience of the president to become a successful lawyer and then enter the political world. In order to become a successful lawyer, one would need to fight a significant lawsuit. Throughout the entire Federation, was there any lawsuit that was more important than the lawsuit of the Silenzhong family in the past few decades? Winning or losing this case didn't depend on the case. The sudden appearance of the Shizhou law firm was undoubtedly a strong warning to the Federation government, to the other forces of the Zhong family, and to the other families. Because it seemed to represent the attitude of Macho Back Mountain. In fact, this was the first time that Tai Yuan was independent of Macho Back Mountain and made his voice heard to the entire Federation. He completely went against the decision of his mother. Tai Yuan looked out of the window and smiled but didn't say anything. Perhaps no one in the universe could defeat his mother, but he wasn't worried about anything. He was the only son in the family for 7 generations. His mother couldn't watch him waste his life out of anger. In this battle between mother and son, the son would always win. Of course, in order to gain the understanding of his mother and the full support of his family, he also made a great compromise. The date of the engagement was finally set for the autumn of the year after next year. He was still the clear-headed, calm, and naturally proud prince, but he suddenly changed his life plan and made such an important decision. Even he himself didn't know if it was some kind of inexplicable sense of responsibility that emerged from the depths of his heart, some kind of desire to complete what he wanted to do for his dead friend, or just he wanted to experience the feeling of living like that guy. Tai Yuan looked up at the sky and sighed softly. He said softly in his heart, "You finally became a damned hero. But do you know how many people in the Federation are mocking your stupidity, your vain individualism, and even angrily accusing you of taking revenge for no reason? I really don't understand why these people are angry. Have they never found out that you are mentally ill?" Tai Yuan coughed softly, took out a bottle of medicine, and swallowed it. He didn't drink water, and then he held his chest and breathed rapidly for a moment. He finally calmed down, and his cheeks gradually became rosy. In fact, all these years, he hadn't been very close to that guy. The fake gentleness and indifference nurtured by the family since childhood, the natural aura nurtured by the glory of the royal family, and that guy's stubborn and sharp personality were somewhat conflicting. Even if they didn't see each other, they wouldn't miss each other. When they occasionally met, peace would slowly spread like a small stream. But once they never met again, when he thought about how his only friend in this life was gone, he would always feel sad, but he thought that was all. "I want to eat scallion pancakes today." Tai Yuan turned around and said to butler Jean, who was standing respectfully at the door of the office. Then he subconsciously paused and smiled inexplicably. Plain porridge and scallion pancakes, the battle in the library, seemed to be something from many years ago. Recently, the Federation's news channel broadcasted the footage of the Bureau of Proclamation's heroic and valiant revenge on the Empire. The value of the Federation's war heroes should be maximized even after death. The funerals of Commander Zhong and his wife were held, as were the funerals of the soldiers who died on the ancient bell. However, Su Li's funeral was not mentioned due to the strong opposition of some people. The tentacles of the glory of the charter that passed through the space channel could no longer find Su Li's chip pulse, and determined that this person was dead. However, many people in the Federation were still waiting hopelessly for some kind of miracle to happen. But if miracles happen too many times, it couldn't be called a miracle. Different seasons passed on different planets, but there was still no news from the other side. In order to prepare for the grand space war that was about to begin, the Federation was making careful and intense preparations. Under such circumstances, under the strong pressure of the fanatical collective consciousness of the Federation people, many disputes were temporarily suppressed. Fatty Tian, Madman Li, and the Crown Prince of the Tai family who were in the West Woods had to make all kinds of compromises. An atmosphere of harmony and sacrifice shrouded countless galaxies. At this moment, it was easy for some people to easily think of a certain person who seemed to never know how to compromise and didn't know how to look at the big picture. On the shore of Lake Feiqing, Jian Shuier, whose black hair cascaded down her shoulders like a waterfall, stood quietly in the morning light behind the old man who was standing in the morning light. After a long silence, she slightly raised her beautiful face, and with a trace of aura that was unknown whether it was inherited from her father or her birth mother, she said seriously, "I know why the Federal Fleet rejected my application, and I can also guess why you are so serious about preventing me from even having a slight chance to enter the Empire. It must be related to my background. There are many things that I don't understand about the military operation on planet 5460. Sula promised me to investigate it, so I didn't ask you. But now that he is dead, I think I should have the ability to ask directly like he did." Li Pifu, the god of war of the Federation, blinked his turbid eyes and looked up at the towering mountain on the other side of the lake. A meaningful smile appeared on his wrinkled face, as if he was somewhat gratified by the girl's courage to ask questions. However, he did not answer the question in the end. After a moment of silence, he changed the topic to another aspect. "I also have a question that I don't understand. How can a person like your father raise a child like Sulu? This revenge from morning to night should have nothing to do with his impulsive personality. It's just that sometimes even I don't understand the decisions he made. The child's actions are so calm, but why is the love and hate hidden under his face so obvious? I feel very sorry about his death." Li Pifu's face was calm as he said slowly in a serious tone, "I thought that in the years before my death, I would be able to watch him grow in a way that no one could have imagined, but I did not expect that he would die in front of me. However..." The old man quietly looked at Jian Shuier, whose face was slightly pale, and said, "All the people of the Federation who enter the Empire will undoubtedly die, but not him. Of course, it's just not necessarily." An asteroid shining with a metallic luster was suspended in the universe. This was the most important forward base of the Federation's star field front line. It gathered the painstaking efforts of several generations of engineers of the Nutshell Company and consumed an astonishingly huge budget of the Federation government. At this moment, it was officially put into use. With this large information node as the hub, it connected all the information nodes in this spacious star field to the other end of the space channel, providing a strong support for the Federation's attack on the Empire. The 1st Regiment of the new 17th Division had been stationed in this giant space base for 3 months. Da Vinci, whose face was covered in grease, climbed out of the twisted tube of the W-type engine. He spat a mouthful of black saliva on the ground, took a cigarette box from his comrade, and lit it up. Then, he began to seriously compare the technical manual to see if he had missed anything during the previous maintenance. Ever since that day when they were trapped in the escape capsule and helplessly watched the 3-winged spaceship leave, the members of Group 7 had become much quieter than before. Even though they were now disbanded and returned to their respective combat units, they were still silent, but they trained even more seriously. Although the men on the battlefield had long been used to parting with life and death, this time felt a little different. Although that guy did not speak much and was even somewhat inconspicuous, it was still a little strange to not have such a leader who would charge at the front and retreat at the back. Da Vinci suddenly saw Bai Yulan's figure from the corner of his eyes. He immediately stood up and gave a standard military salute, then respectfully took out a cigarette and handed it over. Bai Yulan shook his head, and the black hair in front of his forehead suddenly swayed. His voice was a little cold. I quit smoking. For this outstanding military assassin, quitting smoking and relapsing had a kind of self-hypnotizing symbolic meaning. Since that guy had died irresponsibly, the number 37 brand cigarettes seemed to have become tasteless. Bai Yulan did not turn his head as he spoke. His left foot habitually retracted back as usual, and his head was slightly lowered. Under the cover of his black hair, his eyes were as sharp as knives as he stared at a certain spot. Over there, Shang Qiu was leading the staff of the Nutshell Engineering Department to carry out a complicated data calculation. This beautiful genius female engineer did not seem to have changed much from before. Her expression was calm, but her cheeks were a little thinner, which made her look even more delicate. These days, Shang Qiu was working non-stop. Other than that, there was nothing else. Under the long stone steps of Parliament Hill, the vice-chairman of the Green Dragon Mountain Committee, who had just finished a press conference and expressed his full support for the government's invasion of the empire, hurriedly left under the protection of the Special Task Force agents of the Federation. Zhang Xiaomeng, who was preparing to leave, was heavily surrounded by reporters. Madam Zhang Xiaomeng, do you have any thoughts on the unfortunate death of Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu? He's only missing. Zhang Xiaomeng paused for a moment, then calmly corrected them. The Federation is still unable to confirm his whereabouts. As for myself, I quite admire Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's heroic actions. As for the reflection of some people in the Federation on the so-called heroism, I think it's rather rude and retarded. It was rare to see this beautiful spokesperson of the Green Dragon Mountain, and it was rare to hear her positive comments. Naturally, the reporters were overjoyed, and countless questions flooded in. However, after Zhang Xiaoming's simple but direct comments, she didn't answer any more questions and walked into her office on Parliament Hill. The door to the office was tightly shut. Zhang Xiaomeng sat quietly in the large chair. Her black-rimmed glasses were placed on the table. For a long time, she did not make a single sound or movement. Her body gradually loosened up, like a person who had worked hard for many days. Suddenly, she could no longer suppress the deep sense of fatigue in the depths of her body. This boring and hypocritical woman. In the Linyuan suburb of the capital special district, a young man and a young woman sat across the table from each other. They watched the scene in front of Parliament Hill that had just been broadcasted on the TV screen, and at the same time made the same disdainful comments. Then, the two of them were stunned at the same time. Shi Qinghai's charming peach blossom eyes flashed with a trace of luster. Under the accompaniment of the violin outside the restaurant, he said to the woman across the table, "You see, after all, we can still find many things in common. Don't you really want to consider it? Or, we can try to have some more intimate contact and find the feelings of youth. Although I'm already a mother, I've never felt that I'm old." Zhou Yu looked at him coldly and said, "What disgusts me is that you're still in the mood to chase a woman when we don't know whether that guy is dead or alive. Is the friendship between you men as disgusting as the friendship between those rich young ladies?" After saying this, she lowered her head and earnestly fed the delicate food into the little boy's mouth. Today, Zhou Yu wore a red, loose-flowing cloud dress. The smooth skin of her back revealed a large part of her beauty. As usual, there was a bright red flower in her hair, but it didn't look tacky at all. Shi Qinghai glanced at the little boy across the table who was as beautiful as a porcelain doll. He smiled slightly and immediately said with great sincerity, "It's because he's dead that I have to live well for him like I promised him before." After saying this, the two of them fell silent at the same time. Then, they began to drink continuously. The amber liquor was paired with 2 or 3 crystal ice cubes. Zhou Yu's eyebrows gradually blushed, which was extremely charming. Suddenly, she had an idea. She picked up 2 drops of liquor with the tip of her little finger and brought it to the little boy's lips. Zhou Liuhua, who had inherited his parents' excellent biological markers and stubborn temperament, had not yet mastered a rich vocabulary. Therefore, when they were outside, the little boy was always stubborn and refused to speak much. He curiously looked at the tip of his mother's finger that was brought to his lips and carefully stuck out his tongue to lick it. Zhou Yu felt a little ticklish, but her heart was filled with warmth. She smiled happily as she thought of the time when she was drunk in the nightclub. She used her cold appearance to hide her loneliness and unwillingness. Once again, she confirmed that giving birth to this little boy was the best thing she had done in her life. "You, what are you doing?" Shi Qinghai reprimanded somewhat angrily. Zhou Yu didn't pay attention to him at all. She just kept teasing her cute son who was frowning because of the spaciness, but refused to cry. Shi Qinghai couldn't help but feel a little bored. He said self-deprecatingly, "That's right. We are the sons of 2 drunkards. In the future, we will be drunkards too. Let me remind you again." Zhou Yu raised her head and stared at him. The charm on her beautiful face gradually disappeared. "The name on the column of Liuhua's father is Su Lu. I've never fought with a dead person for anything." Shi Qinghai spread out his hands. Suddenly, he said in a low voice, "But if this guy is still alive, fighting with him might be fun." The two of them fell silent again. Shi Qinghai thought for a long time and finally said, "I am a professional skeptic. From the beginning of the Macklin project until now, when the ancient bell was attacked, I feel that there is still a big problem. Brother Jiao. Secretary Jiao's suicide is indeed very suspicious. You better check the files. I will provide you with what I can." Zhou Yu didn't hesitate and replied, "But I believe that my father has nothing to do with this matter. And I have to remind you that the Bureau of Proclamation has already stopped the investigation. This matter may be more complicated than you think. We have to check eventually. It's just that in the past, there were 2 of us. Now that that guy is dead, I am the only one left. But I believe that if he could still speak, he would definitely shout, 'Continue the investigation. Continue the investigation.'" Mr. Scherf smiled and said, "That would really make him look like an idiot. But we can't let that idiot die in vain, right?" After hearing the word "die" so many times, Zhou Yu finally couldn't suppress her depressed mood anymore. She put down the wine glass and stared into Shi Qinghai's eyes. With her unique charm, she said, "He won't die even if you die 800 times. Maybe you know him better than I do." Shi Qinghai stood up and was ready to leave. He smiled and said, "You are right. That guy is either fighting or preparing for a fight. How could he die so easily? Maybe he is starting a new journey somewhere else." "Of course." Zhou Yu raised her beautiful face and said proudly. Chapter 584. In the boundless and vast universe, it was hard to find a word to describe the stars that shone eternally in the farthest reaches of the universe. There was a nebula that had just condensed and extended its first spiral arm. There was an ancient galaxy of unknown age hanging like a silver belt. The deep red and white coldness looked at each other from countless light years away in the dark background. The coldness and indifference of each other made all the onlookers feel that they were small and insignificant, giving birth to a sense of awe that made their bodies tremble. The staff on the Red Rose were already somewhat numb to the scenery outside the transparent dome. After years of working on various spaceships and the long and boring journey, they did not have the extra interest and energy to look at the starry sky outside the transparent dome. No matter how beautiful something was, it could not withstand the wear and tear of time and immutability. When they first met the girl who was like their first love, she was so beautiful that it was soul-stirring. After looking at her for a long time, she gradually became as boring as an old wife. In comparison, the interior of this extremely luxurious spaceship was still able to shock the people who had just joined the team after passing the review. Especially the blue artificial lake, it was even more unbelievable. The spaceships of the Empire had always been designed with the best performance and the least amount of materials. Before seeing this lake with their own eyes, who would have thought that a spaceship would be so extravagant and even crazy to accommodate an artificial lake? Faint starlight sprinkled down from the glass dome, accompanied by additional light inside the spaceship. It passed through the spacious and huge space and mixed with the metallic luster of the tall cabin walls. It fell on the surface of the water, illuminating the tens of millions of tons of seawater. It was so deep that the bottom could not be seen. The waves moved slowly, giving off the feeling of a vast ocean. The tens of millions of tons of seawater came from the most famous summer resort of the Gamma Coast in the southern hemisphere of Tianjing planet. It was said that there was the purest seawater in the entire empire there. At the edge of the artificial lake or sea inside the spaceship, the silver sand from Bansha Prefecture was laid. It was said that the sand grains there were the most well-proportioned and delicate, and the skin of the soles of human feet felt wonderful when stepping on it. On the artificial beach, there were hundreds of tropical plants swaying gently in the convective wind. There were hammocks between the trees, parasols made of large green leaves, and the faint sound of birds chirping could be heard. For such a beautiful scene to appear inside a spaceship in the silent universe, it was a bit shocking. This was the Red Rose, the top spaceship of the Emperor of the Empire. But no one knew why it appeared in the border star field far away from Tianjing planet in the deepest part of the sea, where the pressure of tens of millions of tons of seawater was the most concentrated. It was deathly silent. Unlike the beautiful scenery above the water, the silence here was filled with a suffocating aura of death. On the layer of fine sand at the bottom of the water, there was a naked man struggling and twisting. He wanted to shout out his pain, but he was suppressed by the heavy water from all directions, so he couldn't make a single sound. The powerful muscles on his back twitched, showing how much strength he was using at this moment, but he couldn't get rid of the heavy metal piece tied to his ankle and the black clue above it. There was no air to breathe, no straw to hold on to. There was nothing here, only water. The deep blue, cold seawater that pierced the skin like needles, the seawater that was everywhere, the seawater that was originally gentle but gradually became as heavy as lead, emitting a fishy smell of death. There was also no sound. The man in the depths of the water struggled as if he was crazy, and the water he stirred up couldn't be seen in most of the water. It was like watching life and death through a window, but it clearly conveyed the despair and pain of suffocation that person was in. A normal person who couldn't breathe for such a long time would have suffocated to death, but that man persisted for a much longer time. But he was only a human, not a god, so in the end, those unwilling and desperate struggles gradually subsided. His legs that were tightly tied to the clue kicked powerlessly, and the soles of his feet glowed with a trace of a tragic white. Finally, he stopped. He was like a pitiful dead fish that flipped over and vainly tried to look at the sky with its belly facing the ground before it died. The faint sound of an engine rang out from the surface of the water. The black clue was quickly pulled upwards, pulling the heavy metal piece and the naked man, who was unknown whether he was alive or dead, away from the fine sand at the bottom of the water. Along with a few fine waves of sand, it moved towards the surface of the water. On the beach on the other side of the giant lake, someone was currently fishing. With a light splash, a red koi fish was pulled out of the water by the thin line. It struggled with all its might to shake off its tail, but no matter what it did, it couldn't break free from the fatal hook. The naked man was pulled away from the surface of the lake by the black rope. Water flowed in reverse from his body, flowing along his wet black hair and pouring onto the surface of the lake. According to the calculations, the pressure at the bottom of the lake and the deep suffocation are already level 6 pain. Moreover, this type of pain and fear cannot be said to be tolerable at all. Why is this guy still smiling so happily? An expert from the Empire dressed in white overalls looked at the completely naked man on the workbench. He took out a towel and carelessly wiped this person's shoulders. He said in confusion, could it be that there really is a so-called near-death experience? Before he died, he saw the scene he wanted to see the most. You have to wait until he wakes up before you can ask him. Another slightly older expert said with a smile, I believe this hero of the Federation shouldn't mind sharing it with you. If he isn't willing, perhaps you can also enter the water and give it a try. Let's not. Thinking of the interrogation work in the past few days and the terrifying water torture in the large space, the expert couldn't help but shiver slightly. He picked up the nutrition needle beside him and inserted it into the body. The action of the expert of the Empire was very simple and rough, as if he was vaccinating a pig. The long and sharp needle pierced deeply into the body, but the man on the workbench who was covered in water didn't have any reaction. It seemed that he was in a deep coma. There were 2 flesh holes on his shoulders, inside of which were high-strength golden ropes. The wounds had already formed scabs, and they had peeled off after being soaked in cold water, revealing the tender flesh, which looked extremely horrifying. There were also dense scars on his skin after the torture. After experiencing hellish experiences, he probably wouldn't have much of a reaction to such a rough needle even if he was awake, right? 500 milliliters of awakening injection. Yes. The expert in white started to mix the medicine, but his eyes fell on the left wrist of the man on the workbench. He said in confusion, I'm still very interested in this bracelet. The material is very interesting. It's actually difficult to sample. When did the Federation develop such a high-strength metal? The problem is that it doesn't look like an alloy, and even X-rays can't penetrate it. The other expert shrugged and replied, I'm more curious about what material this guy's body is made of. His physiological data is ridiculously strong. Is it true that the hero promoted by the Federation is really made of special materials? The interrogation has been going on for so many days, and we haven't gotten any useful information. After the 2 experts of the Empire sighed, they looked at each other and shook their heads at the same time. We still lack professional equipment. The Red Rose was the personal spaceship of the Emperor of the Empire. Its space firepower and hull armor were naturally very strong, but it was not equipped with enough advanced detection equipment and torture tools. After all, no matter how perverted and cold-blooded the Emperor was, he would not be interested in enjoying the bloody scene on his own vacation spaceship. His Highness has ordered that if there is still no progress tomorrow, we will cut off his left arm first. The expert smiled and said, this way, we can analyze the bracelet properly. Besides, I don't think this guy's mind can be strong for much longer. Good idea. I've made this suggestion a long time ago. The other person shrugged and slapped the research subject on the workbench hard. His palm fell on the wet stomach of the man, making a crisp sound, as if he was slapping a piece of fresh pork in the market. The breathing and heartbeat frequency collected by the physiological monitoring equipment started to sound the alarm. The man on the workbench woke up, but his eyes were still closed. Only his thick and straight eyebrows, after being soaked in the salty water for so long, were still as calm as a knife in its sheath. The question was unoriginal, and the silence was unoriginal. The buzzing of the machine sounded again. The black thread lifted the man on the workbench and the heavy metal piece tied to his foot, moved horizontally out of the glass partition, and came to the surface of the lake. Then it suddenly released, stirring up a cluster of waves, and sank again. That it was getting deeper and deeper. He slowly opened his eyes. The skin at the corner of his eyes had already festered due to being soaked in the salty water, but his eyes were still bright and clean. Looking at the water that was getting darker and darker, looking at the approaching fine sand at the bottom of the water, listening to the slight sound of water in his ears, and feeling the tingling pressure from his eardrums. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 1, 2, it should be earlier than last time. 13, it's time. He counted silently in his heart, and then his facial features began to twist in pain. He began to struggle again, unwilling and desperate. Opening his mouth wide, he tried to breathe the air that he could never breathe. Feeling the double torture of suffocation and silence, his lungs were burning. A string of pearl-like bubbles poured out from his lips, fleeing toward the surface of the water in panic. Falling into unconsciousness again, the man's body was stuck to the fine sand at the bottom of the water. Because of the struggle before falling into unconsciousness, the upper half of his body had sunk to the bottom of the thin layer of sand. The artificial lake formed by tens of millions of tons of seawater went straight to the bottom of the spaceship. Below the fine sand at the bottom of the lake was a transparent material cabin wall of the Red Rose spaceship. On the other side of the cabin wall, there was naturally an endless, boundless, and quiet space. In the dead and quiet space, the spaceship was moving at a steady speed. If someone looked closely from space at this time, they might be able to see a pale face on the other side of the glass. It was creepy. At this time, the pale face suddenly opened his eyes. He slightly narrowed his eyes, greedily looking at the universe that was right in front of him, but could never be touched. Chapter 585. The first time he sank to the bottom, the second time he sank to the bottom, the third time, Sulu could no longer count how many times this process had been repeated. That day, when he was captured on the Empire's battleship, he was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, he was already on this strange spaceship. Before the difficult torture process, he had carefully observed his surroundings. He was shocked by the spacious interior of the spaceship and the unimaginable facilities. However, when the torture officially began, he no longer had the extra energy to look at these blue lakes, silver sand, and green trees that appeared in space. He was forced to devote all of his physical strength, spirit, and willpower to the process of resisting the water. He had known before that when any ordinary thing exceeded a certain limit in front of a creature, it would always cause a great impact on the creature's nerves. For example, some visual effects were extremely disgusting. However, he had never thought that the weak water that could not be separated from at any time, silently pressing in from all directions, could make people feel such fear. The thin line between death and the cold feeling of being in a silent dead zone was something that no one would want to experience a second time. He had experienced it countless times. At the beginning of the cruel water torture, Sulu was in extreme pain. It was as if his lungs were about to explode, as if his skin was about to split open, as if his eyeballs were about to pop out, as if he was trying to breathe but could only feel the salty water pouring in. When mixed together with the absolute silence of the environment, it was very terrifying. Just like in Master Schiller's plays, where the audience's spirits were lifted and they established the correct view of good and evil retribution, the potential of human beings was always unexpected. They could always see hope in the midst of despair, until they found it. His nerves were much thicker than normal people. This was not only a conclusion of physical anatomy, but also a manifestation of a strong spiritual willpower. In such a desperate situation, he bitterly held on. His mind would occasionally be in a trance, but he never collapsed. Never collapsing was boring repetition. This kind of repetition made people numb. Before the catastrophe, there was an ancient torture called death by 1,000 cuts. At the end of the 1,000 cuts, the prisoners on the wooden frame who were on the verge of death probably would not feel any pain when the sharp knives fell on their pectorals. Sinking to the bottom of the water and then being pulled up, his physiological indicators were monitored. He was injected with nutrition injections, awakening injections, and routine interrogation. Every day after he was captured, he repeated this process. In this numbing and cruel process of torture, there was finally a change. One day, when his naked body was once again thrown into thousands of tons of cold and hard salty water, he was once again in a state of suffocation and unconsciousness. The mysterious lines that were severely damaged in his body seemed to have been awakened by something and began to gradually connect with each other. The weak heat completely ignored the cold salty water around him and began to slowly flow within those lines. Although the speed was extremely slow, it finally moved. Ever since he discovered this fact, Su Li's fear of suffocation had lessened a lot. Only in the depths of the water could he slowly recover his strength without worrying about being discovered by the Empire's people. When the mysterious power in his body gradually recovered to a third, he even looked forward to falling into the water more than 10 times a day, because the bottom of the water was not only death, but also hope. At the same time, Su Li began to pretend to be unconscious with the help of his engineer's meticulous calculation ability and his innate sensitivity to time scales. He tried to use the mysterious power in his body to deceive the sensitive monitoring equipment of the Empire's people. He did not know why the Empire's people did not kill him, but as long as he was alive, there was hope. However, without Tai Yuan, Shou Yu, Magnolia, and the omnipotent charter computer, he still could not find a complete and feasible escape plan. Inside the Empire's spaceship in the silent space, even if he suddenly killed the 2 interrogators of the Empire, where could he escape to? The sand under his feet may be delicate and soft, but it was extremely painful when it rubbed against the skin of his face that was about to fester because of the water. Su Li's pale face buried in the sand did not show any expression at all. He just narrowed his eyes and looked greedily and sadly at the vast and endless black space outside the transparent cabin wall. Inside this extremely luxurious giant spaceship, there were all kinds of monitoring equipment, but the designer did not think of monitoring the cabin wall from the perspective of space outside the spaceship. Only at this moment in the sand could Su Li open his eyes. The black clue under his feet suddenly tightened, and the sharp pain from the rough metal wire rubbing against his festering ankle woke him up from his thoughts of fleeing and looking into the distance like a lookout. He immediately closed his eyes and relaxed his entire body, allowing the black clue behind him to pull him and the heavy metal block to quickly rush to the surface of the water. Floating at high speed, the cold salty water was like an inverted waterfall that kept washing his naked body full of wounds. The pain was so painful that it penetrated his bones. He still closed his eyes and said silently in his heart, "Fight." He had once tried to learn the Empire's language when he was in Group 7's camp in Sunset Province. However, there were too many dialects in the Empire. During the interrogation just now, he could only understand an extremely small portion of what the 2 Empire torture experts had said. However, it was precisely this portion that caused him to tremble in fear and decide to bring forward his escape plan. The secret in the bracelet could not be known by the Empire, and his left arm could not be chopped off by the enemy. So, other than fighting, what other choice did he have? There was no struggle, because things changed again. When he lay on the cold metal platform again with water dripping all over and was about to assume the unconscious and paralyzed posture that he had practiced countless times, he discovered that someone was wiping his body. The very soft semi-long fiber cloth had excellent water absorption properties. The person wiping his body was definitely not that perverted expert. That person would not be so gentle and meticulous, Su Li analyzed silently in his heart with his eyes closed. Immediately after, someone began to treat his wounds. Of course, it was only an extremely simple treatment of the ugly festering skin on his face. There was no in-depth treatment at all. It looked more like makeup, as if the person just did not want his face to be too ugly. A large robe-like garment was put on his body. The electrocardiogram on the monitoring device was as steady as before. Sulu, who was pretending to be unconscious, had countless shocked questions in the depths of his heart. For these cruel and cold-blooded people of the Empire, whether it was cutting off hands or heads, there seemed to be no need for them to put on clothes. Something like dignity before death had never happened between the soldiers of the Federation and the Empire. There was an injection in his neck. It should be an injection to wake him up, right? He thought to himself. Then, he discovered that he was being lifted onto some kind of mobile device and pushed out of the interrogation room toward an unknown place. The grinding sound of rolling wheels grinding against the ground was extremely ear-piercing. Chapter 586. In the quiet room, Sulu closed his eyes and pretended to be unconscious. He tried to figure out which part of the spaceship he was in, but it was all in vain. No one from the Empire had appeared for a long time, so the effect of the awakening injection should have taken effect, but he still didn't open his eyes because he didn't know if there was any monitoring equipment on him, and also because he didn't know how to act when he woke up. But at this time, the disguise had become a disguise that everyone knew. Soft and steady footsteps sounded, and someone walked to his bedside. Feeling a warm finger pressing on his wrist, Sulu became vigilant. The relaxed muscles on his body slowly gathered strength, but the double fiber cells of his muscles were still in a relaxed state. At this time, a strange power gushed out from the finger and rushed to his wrist along the skin that was in contact with the finger. No matter if it was the Federation or the Empire, if ordinary people were to face this moment, they would definitely be confused and feel a sense of mystery. How could the human body produce something like electricity? But Sulu was no stranger to this feeling. Many years ago, after practicing the 10 postures with the uncle, this similar power cycled back and forth in his body. It was just that the burning power in his body was gentle, and once it burst out, it was like a knife. But at this time, the power that was gushing out from the finger of the person beside his bed was violent and tyrannical to the extreme. After entering his wrist, it began to invade his surroundings. Sulu's willpower was extremely strong, and his ability to withstand pain was abnormally strong, but in the face of this power, he couldn't help but groan in pain. The power spat out by the finger on his wrist suddenly exploded. It was as if it had turned into countless scalding hot knives, wantonly cutting the mysterious power channels in his body. A kind of bloody feeling in his mind, a kind of unbearable feeling of the tender flesh inside his body being torn apart, made the hair on his arm stand on end. If this power was allowed to invade and cut, perhaps the mysterious lines that he had been practicing for many years, but didn't know the reason why, would break inch by inch in the next moment. Sulu didn't have much knowledge in this area, but that kind of hair-raising sense of crisis made him subconsciously urge the muscles beside his vertebrae to twitch abruptly. A scorching power suddenly burst out and passed through his body at high speed, along his arm all the way to his wrist, colliding with the power of the finger that had pierced into his body. The scorching torrent that had been accumulating for many days was only a trickle when it started from the back of his waist. However, when it reached his arm, it was already a vast river. When it reached his wrist, his power had turned into a giant beast formed from the icy cold seawater. It roared, and bit down fiercely. The room was still quiet, but there was a gust of wind. The bed sheets were swept up with a whistling sound and shattered into pieces. However, on the extremely small area of skin between the finger and the wrist, a scorched black color suddenly appeared, as if a tiny star was being reborn there. That terrifying finger was bounced a few centimeters away from the power of the collision. The owner of the finger let out a light hum, revealing a hint of surprise that he had long expected to suddenly encounter this situation. However, that finger pressed down even faster. The wrist, the middle of the forearm, the elbow, the upper arm, the armpit, the chin, and all the way to the head. Every finger strike was as soft and fast as the wind, unpredictable and as fierce as the ancient spear, unstoppable. Su Li's body was unable to react effectively in the face of the high-speed finger attacks that were as dense as raindrops, as well as the terrifying power that was spat out between the fingers. He could only instinctively activate the scorching power in his body to incessantly burn and transform, while he retreated quickly and passively. It was extremely difficult for him to resist the fierce force that was even stronger than the previous one. In some kind of religious language in Master Schiller's play, how many seconds did it take to flick a finger? And in this extremely short fraction of a second, how many times did the person beside the bed flick his finger? With a puff sound, like a steel pillar fiercely smashing into the muddy ground, Su Li finally raised his other hand and blocked the most dangerous strike of that finger. His eyes suddenly opened, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. His extremely taut body bounced up from the bed at almost the same time. His right hand that was spread out like a fan retracted, grabbing that steel-like finger. At the same time, his right knee fiercely slammed outwards, smashing towards the outside of that person's thigh. That person's finger suddenly retracted and turned into a fist. It seemed unreasonable, but in fact, it accurately avoided Su Li's right hand. It drew an arc and blasted towards the area below Su Li's earlobe. In an instant, Su Li bent his body, lowered his head, and raised his left arm close to his cheek, like an iron door that was tightly closed. The fist fiercely smashed into the arm, and the tip of the knee fiercely smashed into the thigh. The two people's attacks arrived at the same time, and at the same time, the sudden burst of power produced two loud muffled sounds. Without the slightest pause, the two people, whose figures could no longer be seen, quickly closed in again. The trembling left arm and the slightly stiff thigh no longer existed at this moment. What existed was a ruthless straight finger strike, a clean choke snap of the hand, a simple and clear stagger of the crotch, a sharp and sinister bending of the joint technique, and even more so, a pair of fists that were incomparably fast and fierce. What was even more frightening was that in these powerful close combat techniques, every movement was mixed with an enormous strength that was absolutely unimaginable to an ordinary person. The two figures dodging at high speeds caused the air in the room to vibrate and whistle, followed closely by an ear-piercing tearing and shattering sound. The sturdy bed was shattered into pieces by the overflowing power, and the bedsheets and torn clothes were swept up by the strong wind. In the midst of the mess, a figure flew out in a dispirited manner. Su Li fell heavily onto the hard ground. He immediately turned around and used his right hand to support his body, but was ultimately unable to stand up. He confirmed that his sternum was somewhat dislocated, and more likely, it was fractured. What made him feel even colder was that the scorching power that had been accumulating in his body for a long time was actually showing signs of dissipating. His slightly squinted eyes appeared slightly dim, but there was no despair, only unwillingness and stubbornness. He fiercely stared at the young imperial soldier not far in front of him, and somewhat strangely cracked a smile. The blood that seeped out of his gums and his mouth full of white teeth made his smile appear to be filled with an uncoordinated bitterness. His opponent was a young imperial soldier. He had a thin figure, and his skin was neither bronze black nor noble white. It was just a yellowish brown in between. Just like the feeling he gave off, he was extremely ordinary. If he were to be thrown into the crowd of people on Tianjing planet, there would definitely be no one who would discover his abnormality. However, to Su Li, who had fought with this person twice, no, 3 times, this young imperial soldier was definitely not simple. If Brother Zheng, who was by Li Xiaodong's side, was like a dangerous gun tied in cloth, then this young imperial soldier did not need to deliberately emit a powerful and intimidating aura. His body itself had an indestructible hardness and strength. He was a real gun forged from steel. Just like the alloy multi-layer forging gun that had fiercely pierced into the Black MXT's cockpit that day, cutting off Su Li's hopes of returning to the Federation. Su Li sat weakly on the ground, his eyes narrowed as he stared at the Imperial soldier not far away. He could feel the valiant and dangerous aura that was close at hand. He had previously guessed this person's identity in shock, but due to his ordinary appearance and gender, he did not dare to confirm it. Huai Chaoshu coughed softly and raised his arm to wipe the blood flowing out of his mouth, only to discover that the sleeve on his arm had been shattered and flown away like a butterfly during the battle. Then, he noticed the smile on the Federation soldier's face. "I've read the report. You were smiling every time you suffocated and passed out." The interrogators were very curious as to how the smile came about in such a state. Huai Chaoshu covered his chest and coughed again. Looking at Su Li on the ground expressionlessly, he asked, "Now that I think about it, I understand that you have the ability to hide from the surveillance equipment, recover in secret, and be ready to escape at any time. So, you can't help but feel happy in your heart. But I'm very curious. You can't keep up the disguise anymore, and more than half of the dirty spiritual gas in your body has been dispersed by me. Why are you still smiling?" Su Li moved his body with difficulty and leaned against the wall. His smile gradually faded, and he squinted his eyes and said hoarsely, "I'm smiling now because I've confirmed one thing. The reason why I lost to you on the warship that day was because I was seriously injured. If my body was intact, I should have had a chance to defeat you." The two bloody holes on his shoulders were bleeding non-stop. New flesh split open. It was a horrible sight. Huai Chaoshu turned a blind eye to it. After a moment, he said, "You assassinated Keaton first. The mecha was damaged too much, the cockpit was destroyed, and your body was wounded. Your close combat ability was greatly reduced. But after 2 battles, I'm sure that even if you were intact, you would still be no match for me. You won't know until you fight me." Su Li spat a mouthful of bloody saliva to the side and replied straightforwardly. A trace of mockery flashed across Huai Chaoshu's usually expressionless face. He said, "I allow the loser to carry out a mental battle. I only hope that you can hide the trace of fear in your eyes better." The road to death was in front of him. A powerful and young opponent was in front of him. As a soldier of the Federation, Su Li had to put up a brave front. However, after enduring the torture of millions of tons of water for so many days, after enduring for so long, because of such an unreasonable enemy, the sudden change of events, everything went up in smoke. His mood was sinking into despair, and his unwillingness was rising. Su Li raised his head, squinted his eyes, and said hoarsely, "I admit that I am indeed frightened by your great strength, but you also seem to be somewhat afraid, or perhaps worried that I will recover my health. A little. You, a member of the Federation, seem to have the tenacious vitality of beetles." Huai Chaoshu said expressionlessly, "That is why I am thinking of a method to destroy that laughable desire to live of yours, or perhaps destroy the foundation of this desire. This body of yours is not bad." After saying this, he picked up a metal chair that could barely be considered intact in the room and walked in front of Su Li. Without any hesitation, he raised the chair over his head and then smashed it down forcefully. Blood flew everywhere. The sound of bones cracking rang out. Flesh was torn apart. When the Imperial officers in the monitoring room saw this bloody scene, they all couldn't help but frown. Several streams of warm blood slid across his face. Su Li stared with his pair of not-so-large eyes at the young Imperial officer in front of him and said hoarsely, "I am not threatening you. I also don't know why you all haven't killed me yet, but I suggest that you do." Chapter 587. Not a threat. In reality, it was still a threat. It had been many years since anyone dared to speak to Huai Chaoshu like this. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the Federation soldier in the pool of blood at his feet. His lips curled up into a smile. This person could endure torture for many days without uttering a single word. He was as silent and stubborn as a hot rock. Now, he began to speak harshly. Was it because he was slapped in the face? What an interesting guy. Huai Chaoshu took a step forward and raised his right foot to kick down. His military boot kicked Su Lu in the stomach, making him curl up in pain like a drunk river shrimp. Huai Chaoshu didn't have a special love or hate for this Federation officer in front of him. Since he was very young, he didn't like this boorish and obscene guy, but because of the needs of the royal family's rule, his father needed Keaton to live. Now that Keaton was dead, he was even happier. As for the person who killed Keaton, he naturally didn't hate him too much. But the other party was from the Federation, so he could only live in pain or die in humiliation. The door of the room slid open silently. The Empire's experts and soldiers rushed in and quickly took Su Lu away from the scene. They cleaned up the messy room as quickly as possible. Huai Chaoshu sprayed his favorite light orange air freshener around. Then, he sat by the window in silence for a moment and connected to planet Tianjing. Great Master, is there any news from Fan Manor? He asked expressionlessly into the communication device. The Empire's Royal Intelligence Agency officer on the other end of the communication device replied with a trembling voice, "We brought His Majesty's electronic seal there. Great Master Fan Manor finally opened 3 doors, but we really couldn't find the name list." The officer paused and said respectfully, "Your Highness Su Meng, regarding the last name list, His Majesty has been ordering the Royal Intelligence Agency to try to recover it all these years, but we haven't been able to find any clues. The name list copied in Great Master Fan Manor is also incomplete." I know. Huai Chaoshu lowered her gaze and looked at the royal hibiscus flower symbol on the communication device. She said coldly, "I won't blame you for not being able to find it after so many years. However, Her Majesty is also very concerned about this matter. Therefore, I hope that you can make some progress. Even if it's incomplete, it would be good if you can recover some key words." The senior officers of the Royal Intelligence Agency nodded repeatedly and promised that they would continue to investigate and work hard. After the call ended, Huai Chaoshu sat in the room filled with the faint smell of orange and fell into silence again. Leaving Su Lu alive for the time being was not only because of the Empire's political needs, but also because the Empire's military wanted to obtain more information from him. However, what he was more interested in was Su Lu himself. The 8 rice true qi cultivated by the remnants of the Lees of Philadelphia was a great humiliation to the entire empire, especially to the high and mighty imperial family. Therefore, even if Su Lu was going to be cruelly executed, the imperial family still wanted to destroy the true qi in his body while he was still alive. It could be considered as another form of recovery. Previously, he had personally destroyed the true qi in Su Li's body. At the same time, he had confirmed that this person was indeed one of the remnants of the Lees of Philadelphia and walked the path of the Xiantian realm. However, the Royal Intelligence Agency and the military confirmed that this person was not Li Pifu's illegitimate son. Then, how did he manage to cultivate the 8 rice true qi of the Xiantian realm? Based on certain considerations, he had already asked for instructions from the Tianjing Imperial Palace and was forced to alert Great Master Fan Manor, who had been in seclusion for decades. However, there was still no clear answer. A small probability event was equivalent to an impossible event. Huai Chaoshu frowned slightly and laughed self-deprecatingly. Then, her expression changed slightly. She covered her mouth with her fist and coughed a few times. Intense, heart-wrenching coughs echoed in the room. Su Lu, who was lying in the corner, had a pale face. Beads of sweat rolled down his forehead like soybeans. Previously, he had already noticed that the spaceship had changed its course and was flying towards a blue and yellow planet in the distance. However, at this moment, most of his mind and will were controlled by the coughs. It was difficult for him to divert his attention to think about his next plan and action. Coughs were usually related to colds and unhealthy eating habits. It was not a big deal. However, for the current Su Lo, if he did not solve this coughing problem, his future would be bleak. His originally hopeless escape route would be completely cut off. After the young Empire officer destroyed the power in his body that he had been accumulating for a long time, and after his ability to pretend to be unconscious was exposed, he was once again locked up in a solitary cell. At first, he did not despair. On the contrary, he did not hesitate to start cultivating again with his strong will. However, when the mysterious burning power in his body moved along the familiar channels to his chest and abdomen, it would be blocked by some invisible thing, making it difficult to move forward. If he forcibly moved the burning lines and tried to turn them into countless sharp blades to break through the invisible barrier, the net-like channels in his chest and abdomen would shrink at the same time. It was like a thin film pipe that tightly bound the blade. It was extremely painful to be cut. It could even be said that he was in so much pain that he wanted to die. At this time, his own burning power became as terrifying as the power that the young Empire officer spat out from his fingertips. Now, there were two paths in front of him. If he could not break through the barrier that the Empire officer had magically set up, the power that had accompanied him for many years and saved him countless times during life and death situations would become a dead pool behind his waist. It would no longer be able to play any role, and he would become an ordinary person. No one could endure the pain of the blade cutting through the sensitive passageways. Even if Su Lu suddenly gritted his teeth and completed this action before he fainted from the pain, he was also clear that after those passageways were cut, he would probably end up in a very miserable state, worse than even an ordinary person. As an ordinary person, it was not difficult for Su Lu to accept this fact. He had a good enough psychological foundation. However, now he was imprisoned in the distant empire, facing death and a future more terrible than death at all times. He could not just be an ordinary person. The Red Rose Royal spaceship was quietly parked at the edge of the transit base outside the atmosphere of Liban Star. The giant spaceship was close to 20 kilometers long, making the three-dimensional six-directional space base next to it look extremely small. In the next few days of docking and refurbishment, the space base would continuously send the materials on Liban Star to the Red Rose. It looked like this giant royal spaceship was like a big insect that greedily sucked the blood of herbivores. The fleet of Liban Star took off one after another, lining up in the vast universe outside the atmosphere, escorting the three light battleships that flew out from the Red Rose royal spaceship and flew down. Chapter 589. Liban, an unremarkable second-class administrative planet in the vast territory of the Empire, gradually became different due to the two edicts from the Tianjing planet a few years ago. The establishment of the Empire's special tourism zone, the exaggerated investment by the Ministry of Finance, countless nobles and wealthy merchants came to join in the fun, and the Emperor's strict implementation of the interracial education experiment made this planet the center of the Empire's discussions. Being able to become a special tourism zone and help the Emperor justly divide the wealth of the nobles, the Liban planet naturally had enough beautiful scenery. Regardless of whether it was the spectacular Crimson Hill in the Western Hemisphere, the fog that covered the sky of Pine Cone Ridge, or the tens of thousands of stone peaks that pierced the sky of Yellowstone, they were all rare beauties that fully demonstrated the godlike carving ability of nature. The Liban planet also had the most beautiful scenery, and that was the mulberry trees that spread across the flat plains. Tens of thousands of square kilometers of mulberry trees were artificially divided into countless work areas. The rustling of the mulberry trees when the wind blew through was breathtaking, and the quiet night was endlessly quiet. The mulberry trees and the moth larvae that accompanied them were the most famous specialties of this planet, apart from the natural scenery and the newly built universities in the various states. Many years ago, the silk spat out by the larvae of these moth larvae became the most beloved luxury of the empire's nobles. What was very strange was that, apart from the Liban planet, there were countless planets in the empire that were completely suitable for these delicate larvae. The unusually expensive silk entered the Federation along with some great collision in the universe. For decades, the only goods that were qualified to take the risk and enter Bermuda with the Royal Special Forces mecha warriors was silk. The Empire used this smuggling to seize a large amount of wealth from Bermuda and the upper echelons of the Federation. Although this wealth was far from enough to offset the Empire's military expenditure, perhaps because of some emotional and childish considerations, what we have, you don't, you have to wait for us to provide, so we are superior to you. The Empire's royal family had always condoned and even strongly supported the silk smuggling. The Federation had tried to win this childish dispute, but the strictest wildlife protection laws and the HTD Bureau officials who liked to wear iron masks in public prevented the Federation from planting mulberry trees and using warm water to cook the white silk balls woven by the larvae. The Federal Academy of Science had also tried to use biological methods to restructure, but without the technical support of the Bureau of Proclamation in terms of biological proteins, they found that this attempt would cost a lot of money, so they had to stop the plan and continue to buy silk underwear, silk quilts, silk bras, silk chest pads, and everything that was made of silk and hidden in private places. Two skinny young tourists were walking on a street in the southern district of Planet Lisban. The silk clothes they were wearing were not particularly eye-catching, but compared to the local residents, it was easy to expose their identity as tourists. However, there were too many tourists on Planet Lisban these past few years, and these two people with ordinary faces would not attract much attention. In addition to the hundreds of well-trained professional soldiers in the 4 blocks around them, the soldiers in charge of secret security were watching the two people's every move with a heavy expression, vigilantly watching the wind and grass in the surroundings. These two young tourists did not look like close friends who were traveling together, because when one of them coughed uncontrollably and closed his eyes to fight back tears, the other did not show any concern at all. He continued to walk indifferently, his slightly narrowed eyes full of coldness. Sulu felt that his lungs were full of hot smoke, and his throat was full of red-hot gravel. It was extremely difficult to cough, and it was very uncomfortable. Half squatting on the ground, he breathed rapidly for a long time before finally calming down the pain in his chest and abdomen. He forced himself to stand up. The wound on his shoulder had temporarily stopped bleeding, but the strange power that the Imperial officer had wedged into his body was still tormenting him incessantly, preventing him from using his power to heal his body. Like a slowly rotating rock, it kept grinding and grinding, trying to grind all of his hopes into pieces. It was very strange. After coming to this strange Imperial planet from the Red Rose Royal spaceship, he still did not die, nor was he thrown into the dark prison where he could not see the light of day. Instead, he was temporarily free from the cruel water torture that made people wish they were dead. He began to follow the young Imperial officer and enjoy the scenery on this beautiful planet. In a few short days, he stood on the spaceship and looked down at the magnificent Crimson Mountains in the Western Hemisphere. Those waves that were nearly 100 meters high were as thick as blood, and they swayed his hard heart up and down. He wore a breathing device that was specially used by the Imperial military, and he climbed through the fog in the depths of Pine Cone Ridge for an entire night with difficulty before he finally broke through the fog. He stood on the ridge and saw the first ray of morning light. The damp morning dew moistened his painful lungs and made him feel slightly comfortable. He even tied a small jet device to his back and flew like a natural bird among the indescribably steep stone peaks of Yellowstone. During the Thai dynasty, prisoners would always have a good meal and drink before they died. Now that he was in the empire, although it was also an imperial society, Sulu did not think that these were the benefits before he died. It was too ridiculous. He stroked his chest that seemed to have been cut by a spear tip, shook his head and exhaled. He stood up and looked at the young imperial officer who had already left more than 10 meters away. He stretched out his hands and rubbed his somewhat stiff face until a few traces of indifferent smile appeared on his face. Only then did he chase after him with big strides. On the street, a brown-haired man with messy hair was holding a little girl's hand and saying something. They were probably father and daughter because they both had a pair of beautiful sky-blue eyes, and the curve of their jawline seemed to have been carved by the same sculptor. However, for some reason, they were arguing. Some of the tattered clothes were wrinkled and torn by the big hand and the little hand. The little girl was crying. On the right side of the back wall of a restaurant, a black dog was running quickly. Its sharp mouth held a simple and honest bone. The black dog was running very resolutely and its goal was very clear. It bypassed the beggar who was lying in the shadows and lifting his lapel to check for his next meal. It jumped over half of the broken wall and ran towards the mulberry forest in the suburbs. It was silent all the way. It probably also knew that if it shouted happily, the food would fall. At the turn of the road in front, a person who looked like a boss wearing silk clothes was talking to a farmer. The reason why he was talking to the farmer was because the farmer with a box under his arm was getting lower and lower as he spoke. It seemed like he was about to kneel. Beside the two people, the listless middle-aged man should be a soldier. The tourist further in front was also a soldier. The driver of the carriage that had been following behind them for half an hour was also a soldier. This seemingly peaceful street was filled with their people. Sulu walked behind the young military officer of the Empire. He walked silently and observed the surroundings. If he didn't know what the people of the Empire were thinking, then he shouldn't think about it anymore. His best ability was to simplify complicated things. He simply thought of himself as a real tourist. It was rare for him to go deep into the territory of the Empire. Looking at this strange world, listening to the strange language of the people in the streets and alleys, and looking at the animal-drawn cars that surprised him, he vaguely understood why the uncle said that he was willing to wander in the universe. However, he still couldn't clearly explain this feeling. In front of a vast sea of green mulberry trees, Wai Chaoshi stopped and slowly put his hands behind his back like an old man. His cheeks were slightly raised, and he narrowed his eyes and took a deep breath of fresh air. Where his eyes fell, the leaves of the mulberry trees were gently swaying in the wind. It seemed that he could hear the rustling sound with his sight without his ears. Rustle, rustle, rustle. It was the sound of mulberry leaves being blown by the wind, and it was also the sound of silkworms nibbling on them. A gentle smile suddenly appeared on the face of the young man with the noblest status in the Empire, which had never changed. He seemed to have thought of some interesting childhood memories. His smile gradually disappeared. Wai Chaoshi only allowed the memories to occasionally flood into his mind. Occasionally, he would be moved by the 4 seasons, but he would immediately return to absolute calmness. Although I really don't understand, I still have to thank you for taking me to see so many beautiful sceneries. Sulu coughed twice and looked at the sea of mulberry trees in front of him in surprise. Right now, he was standing side by side with Wai Chaoshi. He didn't have the consciousness of a condemned prisoner at all, and he didn't notice the anger in the eyes of the plainclothes soldiers around him. Wai Chaoshi glanced at him coldly from the corner of his eyes. He didn't answer, but a strange light flashed through his eyes. If there were no accidents, this Federation person beside him would be tortured to death after all of his value was squeezed out, unless he agreed to defect. He definitely didn't have any sympathy for this. He was just a little curious about Su Li's current behavior. The flames of war continued for decades. The Empire had captured many Federation soldiers and even high-ranking officers. Among the Federation soldiers who knew that they were going to die, some passionately scolded the Empire's emperor, some cowardly cried and knelt on the ground to beg for their lives, some remained silent, and some pretended not to care. However, there were very few like this person who could actually immerse himself in the scenery in front of him before his death. The Red Rose was temporarily resting, and Huai Chao-shi was like a tourist hiding in the Liban Star. He wasn't in a hurry to return to Tianjing Star because the political situation in the empire had been surging with hidden waves recently. He needed to be outside the situation and help his father see the situation clearly. Furthermore, as the person involved, if he returned to Tianjing Star a day later, it would be helpful for his father to deal with the situation. As for why he brought Su Lu along for sightseeing, there were two very simple reasons. One of them was that a dangerous person like Su Lu would not find any chance to escape only if he personally watched over him. I've checked your details. You seem to be a person with perfect morals, an existence similar to a saint. Huai Chao-shi said with slight sarcasm, "Don't be in a hurry to reject me. Your government has been building you up according to a saint." Huai Chao-shi slowly took a few steps forward, then turned around on the mound and looked down at him. "I really want to know if you are really a saint. Would you feel ashamed because of the morals in your heart? Would you recognize your sins before you die?" Sins. I'm not a person with perfect morals. When I was young, I also peeked under the skirts of female police officers. However, when it comes to sins, other than some innocent people that I accidentally killed, I would recognize them. However, Su Lu replied, "This definitely doesn't include people from the Empire." Huai Chao-shi was expressionless and suddenly asked, "What do you think of the Empire's scenery?" "It's very beautiful and spectacular," Su Lu replied honestly. "You tried to invade our country and turned these beautiful scenery into a hell of war. As a Federation soldier, shouldn't you feel guilty?" You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.